The meeting number 79 of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to study the question of privilege related to the member for Wellington, Halton Hills, and other members. I would like to remind all members and witnesses that care must be taken with regard to the earpieces for interpretation. Please be mindful to not place your earpiece near the microphone, as this can result in a feedback loop, which may cause an acoustic shock, which could in turn cause injury to the interpreters. So basically, if you use an earpiece, keep it in. If you don't, leave it to the side, and that's probably the best way. Playing with it, maybe not the best option right now. Reminder comments will all go through the chair. The clerk and I will maintain a consolidated speaking list. And we have with us today Ms. Jody Thomas, National Security and Intelligence Advisor. Ms. Thomas, you have up to 5 minutes to appear, and I do really want to thank you and your team for responding back to us so quickly with your availability, and I'm hoping that others hear this message because then they will get praise. And so I will give you praise for responding so quickly and being here with us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is a pleasure to be here again today. Les enjeux.
The issues under consideration by this committee are very serious, and I am pleased to be able to speak about them with you today. This is not the first time that you have invited me as part of this study, but the situation evolves just as the public debate has evolved. Since my last visit, there have been many important developments.
The Independent Special Rapporteur issued his first report on May 23rd, which reached a number of conclusions. First, the Independent Special Rapporteur concluded that foreign governments are undoubtedly attempting to influence candidates and voters in Canada, and that while much has been done already, more remains to be done promptly to strengthen our capacity to detect, deter, and counter foreign interference activities in our elections. Indeed, the government and the intelligence agencies have communicated regularly about the pervasive growing threat of foreign interference. And while work has been done to mitigate and counter the threat, more work is required to effectively counter the evolving threats of our adversaries. On 6 April, Minister LeBlanc and the Clerk of the Privy Council submitted a report to the Prime Minister which outlined the progress made so far in implementing recommendations of previous reviews on foreign interference and election security and laid out a path for future actions. This spring, Public Safety Canada launched and completed a public consultation on a foreign influence transparency registry. Work is also well underway to develop legislative proposals to modernize legislation so that intelligence and law enforcement agencies can better detect the threat, assist Canadians in protecting themselves against it, and hold to account foreign interference actors. In addition, the Security and Intelligence Threats to Election (SITE) Task Force has begun enhanced monitoring and assessing foreign interference threats as 4 concurrent by-elections are underway. The Independent Special Rapporteur also concluded that there are serious shortcomings in the way intelligence is communicated and processed from security agencies through to government. We've already made a number of changes to improve how intelligence is communicated and coordinated in government. Public Safety Canada has established a National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator who will drive the government's proactive response to the threat of foreign interference. We have also strengthened our governance. I have created a new Deputy Minister Committee, the Deputy Minister Committee on Intelligence Response, which will examine intelligence, direct appropriate response, and develop related advice for the government. In addition, the Minister of Public Safety recently issued a direction that parliamentarians will be informed of threats to them whenever possible and within the law while protecting the integrity of investigations. The direction also calls for the Minister of Public Safety to be informed of all instances of threats to the security of Canada directed at Parliament or parliamentarians in a timely manner. As you are aware, the work of the Independent Special Rapporteur is being complemented by the work of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, NCCOP, and the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, INSIRA, which have both undertaken reviews of foreign interference in Canada's democratic processes. The Independent Special Rapporteur has also recommended that the confidential annex to his report be referred to NCCOP and INSIRA for their review. We are working to support the work of these bodies in the second phase of the Independent Special Rapporteur's mandate unreservedly. We know that further long-term changes are required to ensure that Canada and Canadians have the tools they need to stop foreign interference. The work of this committee, as well as the continued analysis of the Independent Special Rapporteur, the ongoing reviews of NCCOP and NCR, will all contribute to inform these changes. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank you very much. And we will now enter the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Romanado, Madame Goudreau, and then Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Thomas, for being here. Through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Thomas. We are here because of the July 20th, 2021 CSIS memo that indicated that a Beijing diplomat accredited by this Liberal government was targeting a sitting member of Parliament, Michael Chong, by threatening to sanction his family in Hong Kong. This memo was sent to the Prime Minister's department, the PCO, and for 2 years, the Prime Minister did nothing. The government did nothing. The Prime Minister repeatedly claims that he first learned about this memo in the Globe and Mail. When did you learn about the memo?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. As I said to Mr. Chong at the time of the CSIS briefing to him, I learned about it in the Globe and Mail. I had not previously seen the report, nor had the Prime Minister.
You learned about it in the Globe and Mail, and then suddenly, after it was reported in the Globe and Mail, 2 more MPs, Aaron O'Toole and Jenny Kwan, have been briefed by CSIS that they too were targets of the Beijing regime. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that these MPs, including the former leader of the opposition, was targeted by Beijing?
The Prime Minister was not made aware of the targeting against Mr. Chong or Ms. Kwan before recent events and reporting. That has been done by CSIS. So CSIS has brought this forward to him in the last 2 to 3 weeks.
You said the Prime Minister wasn't aware in the case of Mr. Chong or Ms. Kwan. What about Mr. O'Toole?
Or Mr. O'Toole is my understanding.
And he would have learned about that, you're saying, since May 1st?
Yes.
And when did you become aware that Ms. Kwan and Mr. O'Toole were targeted?
In the last 3 to 4 weeks.
In the last 3 to 4 weeks, and how did you become aware of that?
Through a briefing from CSIS.
It seems to me inconceivable that we have at least three sitting members of Parliament that were targeted by Beijing, including by an accredited diplomat, and that you didn't know, and the Prime Minister didn't know, and only now, coincidentally, that it has been revealed in the Globe and Mail, is action being taken. How is that possible? How is that conceivable that neither the National Security Advisor, which is you, or any of the former National Security Advisors, or the Prime Minister were completely in the dark about this? It seems to me, Ms. Thomas, and I'll let you respond, but it seems to me that this is a breakdown of the machinery of government under this Prime Minister's watch. Would you at least agree with that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cooper, as I said previously, I wasn't here in 2021, and I cannot account for the lack of information flow to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, and I'm not going to speculate. I agree that there needs to be a better management of intelligence that is coming into deputy ministers' offices, into the NSIA office, in order to brief the Prime Minister and brief ministers. And we have taken steps to ensure that will happen. And not only to brief, but to provide advice on what should be done with the intelligence. Because reading the intelligence is one element of this problem. Giving advice on what to do about it is the second part of the problem, and we have strengthened both of those processes.
Ms. Thomas, through you, Madam Chair, you've said that the Prime Minister didn't know, and you didn't know. So that's not just a matter of what to do about it or how to act on it. You said he just didn't know. But except for the fact that what we do know is that in the case of Mr. Chong, the Minister of Public Safety was emailed about it by CSIS in May of 2021, but he didn't have the login information to his email after 18 months on the job. And then this memo was sent by CSIS not to anyone, but to the PCO and specifically the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. So again, how is it that the Prime Minister didn't know? Why were those MPs kept in the dark? And in the face of all of that, would you not at least concede that that is a colossal breakdown of the machinery of government under this Prime Minister's watch?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've said, I cannot account and I will not speculate about what went on in 2021. And I know you are seeing my predecessors and I know you're speaking to CSIS. I think that there was a breakdown in process and we've rectified not only a breakdown in process, I think insufficient process. And so we have rectified those problems.
I would submit it's more than a breakdown in process. It is a colossal failure on the part of this Prime Minister that we would have 3 MPs that have been targeted. How many more MPs have been targeted by the Beijing regime?
CSIS will speak to you about their holdings when they're here.
Are those MPs going to be briefed, or are we going to find out about it in the Globe and Mail and then we're going to be briefed?
I think it's very clear from the direction given by the Prime Minister and the ministerial directive from Minister Mendicino to CSIS and to the other intelligence agencies in his portfolio that the expectation is, yes, MPs will be briefed on the totality of the holdings against them, regardless of the depth, the severity, the reliability of those holdings. So members of Parliament who are in the holdings of CSIS will be getting very thorough briefs.
Thank you. Madame Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank Ms. Thomas for being here, and thank you again for coming back to PROC. So we've been hearing a little bit about the process in which information flows and the amount of intelligence that someone in your position as National Security and Intelligence Advisor would receive. At a macro level, how much intelligence would actually come to your team every day?
Thank you for that question. Our security agencies collect somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 pieces of intelligence, sovereign intelligence a month. And then that's compounded and multiplied by the intelligence we receive from Five Eyes. And so I have a reading file where I follow very specific issues. Obviously, I follow what is going on in Ukraine. I follow what is going on in China, foreign interference. And so I have a reading package put together on me based on either subjects or geopolitics or where we have, for example, Canadian Armed Forces troops stationed. And so my reading package on any given day can be somewhere between 150 and 100 pieces of intelligence. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's larger. There is no regularity to it. There are some pieces of intelligence that are sent to me as in PCO, only I can read it, and then I make the determination who it's going to go to. We are working to ensure that when there are pieces that must be seen by somebody, that the client relations officers who work in departments for CSE and distribute the intelligence make sure that that intelligence is seen and it is acknowledged that it has been seen. I think that was a breakdown in process previously, that it was not seen.
So could you walk us through how intelligence, so you receive intelligence that can be very vast with respect to anything with respect to our Canadian Armed Forces, with issues abroad, with issues domestic as well. How is that packaged and get to, like, what kind of apparatus is sending you this kind of information? We know that obviously CSIS, CSE, but are you receiving from multiple parties, and how does that get to you in terms of your package?
So there are people who, thank you, Madam Chair, there are people who are certainly far more capable of explaining the system to you because they work in the system. But essentially it is put into a system called Slingshot, or it is sent through a TS or secret method to certain addressees. In my case, it's printed for me. I can access it myself. Generally, it's printed for me. I get a reading package every day, and I read that package. The types of pieces of intelligence range. We can get assessed pieces. The Intelligence Assessment Branch in PCO does assessed pieces. That means they take the raw intelligence and they use the techniques they've been taught and the analytical methodology that they refine here in Canada and with Five Eyes to tell us what the intelligence means, the raw intelligence. We also get single source, uncorroborated pieces that say X may have happened. The intelligence agencies keep all of that. Their holdings are substantial, and what they share is not everything that is in their holdings. And so it is critical to understand that what they try to do is ensure that senior leaders in the intelligence and security world are aware of what they're capturing, and they identify its credibility. We think you need to know this. It's not yet credible. That will become the basis for potentially more reporting. And it builds a dossier on any particular file or person. And so it is rare that a piece of intelligence is a smoking gun. It is a story. It is built over time. And it requires analysis and judgment on what to do with it.
So thank you so much. So in that regard, it's sort of like a puzzle piece. You have a small piece of the puzzle, and so what may at first glance be, okay, this is interesting, however, not at a situation where it needs to move up. So I'm assuming when we have the other witnesses coming, we can ask them explain to us sort of how that judgment is on when does that meet we need to send this up to the next level. I'm assuming they are making those decisions based on the little pieces of the puzzle that they are having once they have a more accurate picture, unless, of course, as you said, there's something very significant, very credible, very imminent that would require immediate attention. Would that be correct?
I think, yes, Madam Chair, that's a very good summary of how the system works. What we have now done is ensured, based on the Prime Minister's direction, that anything that mentions foreign interference in an MP is briefed up regardless of its credibility or how confident we are in the reporting. We also then take that intelligence and ask CSIS or CSE for what else they have on that particular thread. To try and build a bigger picture and give advice to the government. And sometimes that advice will be, there is nothing to do yet. Sometimes that advice is, we should not brief yet. Other times it will be, we think you need to take action.
And that's something new that you've just put in place. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Goudreau, thank you very much, Chair. I just thought of something that was said. The Prime Minister gives directives, it was said. And one would wonder why we're sitting here, despite the fact that there are ways to filter information. So can you tell me what exactly the directive is from the Prime Minister in terms of an alert level? I'd like to know more about this. Perhaps you haven't had an opportunity to speak to us about this when you've come before the committee.
Thank you very much for the question. The Prime Minister, I think, was quite unequivocal. He directed the intelligence agencies to ensure that MPs are briefed and that he is to be briefed on any information and intelligence that is received about foreign interference that targets a member of Parliament. Minister Mendicino then further put that into a formal document that is called a ministerial directive. And the ministerial directive tells CSIS that regardless of the credibility of the threat, if there is something that comes in on an MP, he is to be briefed and that MP is to be briefed.
So is that going to happen from now on, but that was not the case previously?
Yes, absolutely. That is going to happen from now on. It wasn't the case previously because there is a range of information that comes in, and some of it isn't credible. It is concerning. It would worry the MP if they were told. But I think that the lesson learned out of this is that early reporting is better, even if the piece of intelligence that has arrived is not a credible piece or cannot be verified.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, I'm very aware of the fact that there are all kinds of alerts and memos and information, thousands a month. However, I'm very troubled by what I learned today, and that is that we had other things to do in PROC, but actually our work is extremely important because previously communication and how alerts are processed based on what we heard, are not necessarily forwarded or sent on. There's an intelligence culture out there, and I'd like to know why we are at the state we are today. Someone had to speak in the media so that we'd know about this. Otherwise, we wouldn't be correcting our course here. Can you explain how people can regain their trust? How can they be confident now? I'm going to give you the opportunity to speak to this. How is it that we got to this point today?
Thank you very much for that question. I think I would say first and foremost that the evaluation of the panel of five, based on the information given to the site task force, the 2 post-election reviews, the work done by NCCOP, and the analysis by the independent special rapporteur assures us that the elections were free and open and safe, and that the outcome of the elections should not be questioned. I think that's really important. In terms of informing the Prime Minister and ministers and relevant MPs about particular pieces of intelligence, previously, CSIS has been very strict in interpreting their act about defensive briefings and threat reduction measures. And so the Minister Mendicino has given them very stringent direction about how they are to move forward. I think that is reassuring. Now, yes.
C'est pour ça, en fait, que là...
Well, that's why I'm asking the question, because here we have 3 colleagues now affected by this. And that's why we're here today, because we're talking about the parliamentary privilege of one of these members. And because of this, there is action now. But what I'm thinking is that previously, the government wasn't in a position to be able to adequately protect parliamentarians, right?
First, it's an important point you're making, and thank you, Madam Chair. Important to note that the physical security of any of these MPs has not been in question, and there is no physical threat. I understand completely that the information that has been leaked to the media or now briefed to members of Parliament is shocking and disturbing to hear. It should not have happened in this manner. I acknowledge that. I cannot speak about what happened previously. We are going forward in a completely different direction that I think will assist the government and all members of Parliament and all Canadians in understanding the threat that is foreign interference and how we are going to deal with it. And it will be through more transparency and more discussion about what is actually happening.
Reste 30 secondes.
30 seconds left. Can you tell me if anything was missing for you within your work to be able to better understand these alerts? We listen to witnesses. We've heard about how much information comes in and how it's classified or not, or how it's ranked as urgent or non-urgent. I mean, how do you proceed with the most serious of cases?
So I think what is important to note is that we should not be relying on any single individual to read intelligence and decide it's going to move up, and that if it's not read by that individual, it falls by the side of the table. If I miss my reading package for one day because I'm traveling, that should not mean that information is not shared with the clerk of the Privy Council, ministers, or the Prime Minister. And so we have now a more robust process to ensure that actionable intelligence and non-actionable intelligence, but particularly in the foreign interference space, is discussed and moved to ministers, the clerk, potentially the Prime Minister, Prime Minister's office, with not only the raw intelligence, but advice on what to do about it.
Merci.
Thank you.
Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank you, Ms. Thomas, for being here with us today. So I guess I'm listening, and I'm really trying to wrap my head around this, because this is incredibly serious. And the impacts are profoundly concerning, and the way that people are learning and the timeline in which they are learning is highly concerning. And I think when we look at this whole process, what I'm seeing is an increase of distrust in Canadians and in parliamentarians. And I think, hopefully, that's something that we would want to see avoided. So I just have to go back to a couple of things. So you're saying that the Prime Minister and yourself only found out about this 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then you're saying that now we are strengthening the process of intelligence receiving, reviewing, and providing advice. So are you really telling me that this completely was broken and in 2 or 3 weeks you fixed the problem? Because that's what it sounds like to me. And I can't put that together. How does that work? And can you explain how that works? It just doesn't make sense. Because if it was this simple to fix, then why on earth was it not fixed earlier? Why are we here today? And so if you could explain, that would be very helpful to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've said, I was not in this job in 2021. In 2021, I was the Deputy Minister of National Defence, and in July 21, I was most concerned about Afghanistan. And so I didn't read the intelligence on foreign interference. As I said, everybody has their reading packages about things that are relevant to them. As the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, certainly have to have a broader view and see different and more intelligence than I did in the past. What my predecessors did, they will be here. You will have to speak to them. My observation, even before the foreign interference issues have been in the press and been a priority discussion, is that we collect a lot of intelligence and assess a lot of intelligence, but what we don't do a good job of is giving advice to government. The intelligence agencies don't give advice. Deputy ministers give advice to ministers, to the clerk of the Privy Council, and to the Prime Minister. And I felt that was a gap. We were moving forward on, for example, advice on what to do on intelligence we saw on Ukraine in a different way, not significantly different than what I've described to you in terms of assessing the intelligence, deputy ministers, and the Chief of the Defence Staff in the case of Ukraine, having a discussion about what the intelligence means and what the government should do with it. Because what you do with it is the critical part of intelligence. And sometimes the answer is nothing, because you need to continue collecting, because you need to investigate further. And sometimes it is...
So I only have a few more minutes. And I mean, I guess what your answer is, yes, we fixed the problem. So I'm really interested in seeing how that works. But I don't know if you're going to tell us as clearly as I was hoping you to do. So you keep saying as well that you can account, and I hear that the folks from previous role in this role will be here for us. So I guess my question to you then is that when you arrived on the scene, did you have discussions with your predecessor? And when you had those discussions, was there no moment where there was discussions about intelligence and how it might be impacting parliamentarians? There was no concerns brought forward to you? You just came like a clean slate and then all of a sudden these things erupted? I'm just hoping you can clarify that.
The director of CISA certainly spoke to me about foreign interference and not... only the threats against parliamentarians, foreign interference writ large, because the foreign interference activities that are taken on by adversaries are much broader than just elections.
And I understand that, but we're actually talking about a point of privilege,
Right.
so I think it's important that we stay clear
So-
on that. So if I could just, like, was there any passing on? Because again, it feels like this was a bit of a surprise. Emails were sent out to ministers. They didn't know how to open the emails. It's just so confusing, but the impacts are profound because it does create a sense of distrust. And I think when we look at this, perception matters. Like we can debate a whole bunch about what this and that means. Perception matters. And in our systems right now, parliamentarians are feeling concerned that they don't know. I mean, I remember asking a question several weeks ago where I said I could happily be walking down the street doing my job as a member of parliament, as a candidate in an election, and I could be being targeted and nobody would tell me. How do you fight something that you don't know is happening to you? So what I'm trying to understand is, how did this get left behind? How is it that all of these things have happened? They've been reported in the media, and we can talk about the source of that media and where it's coming from. But the real reality for me is, why was this not caught as an issue? And why do we have to be here? And how are we going to fix it moving forward? But also take accountability for the history.
So, thank you for that question. I think everything you are saying is very important, and I don't disagree with it. I would not characterize that ministers couldn't open their email. The top secret email system means that we deliver email to them. And so that's a responsibility of the public service. The transparency with which we need to speak to parliamentarians is evident. I would say that CSIS has been limited by their act. They are not able to share all of their intelligence except for through a formal threat reduction measure, and they are now using those more aggressively than they have in the past.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull, Madame Goudreau, Mrs. Blaney. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Thomas, through you, Madam Chair. On May 3rd, 2 days after the Globe and Mail reported that MP Chong had been a target of the Beijing regime and that CSIS had been aware of this, the Prime Minister told reporters that, quote, CSIS made the determination that it wasn't something that needed to be raised to a higher level because it wasn't a significant enough concern, end of quote. We know that that statement isn't true. Why did the Prime Minister say that?
Thank you very much for the question. In the early days of understanding what the scenario was and the intelligence that led to the document that was written in July 2021 that referenced an MP, it did not reference Mr. Chong. Nonetheless, it did talk about an MP being targeted. We were not aware that the underlying intelligence had been moved from CSIS into the system and distributed. So it was an error in terms of the information provided to the Prime Minister.
Did you provide that? Did you tell the Prime Minister that?
Yes.
And you specifically told him it had not been raised to a higher level?
I told him that it had not been briefed to him, and I didn't know what had left CSIS.
Well, that's very different than what the Prime Minister said, because he didn't say that that he wasn't briefed. He didn't say that he didn't know where it went. He said he made a very specific declaration that it had not been raised. So he said more than that. So again, why did he not state what in fact happened? Why did he mislead Canadians?
Madam Chair, I don't think that's an appropriate question.
Well, I think it is an appropriate question. I think Canadians have a right to know why it is the Prime Minister would make such a statement when it is turned out to be patently false.
Madam Chair, I think the Prime Minister reflected the information he had at the time. He told us to keep working. He organized a meeting with Mr. Chong, and we briefed Mr. Chong.
Yeah, and suddenly, 24 hours later, you call MP Chong and you advise him that, contrary to what the Prime Minister had said only 12 hours or 24 hours earlier, but that wasn't so, that in fact the memo had gone to the PCO and had specifically gone to the then National Security Advisor, to the Prime Minister. So what happened between when the Prime Minister made that very affirmative statement that it had not been raised to a higher level to your phone call with Mr. Chong, where you said, in fact, it was exactly the opposite of what the Prime Minister said?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. Mr. Chong, in his briefing, asked me if the memo had been distributed, who received it. I told him I did not yet know. And upon finishing the review of where it had gone, I briefed the Prime Minister, and I returned the call to Mr. Chong as I promised I would.
And what did you find out? And how did you find that out?
We traced all the addresses. We found out who it had been sent to and tried to determine why it had not been briefed up.
And upon tracing all of the addresses, you discovered that it had gone to the director of, or the National Security Advisor, correct?
We did.
And who else did it go to?
Well, as I told Mr. Chong, it went to several deputy ministers, and it's incumbent upon the deputy ministers to brief those ministers.
Went to several deputy ministers. Which deputy ministers?
Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Minister of National Defense.
It went to 3 deputy ministers plus the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor. And that happened in 2021.
Yes.
And it went nowhere.
That is correct.
You want Canadians to believe that?
Madam Chair, I don't think the integrity of my statements here and what I said to Mr. Chong are in question. It is absolute fact that the memo was distributed and it was not briefed to the Prime Minister.
Was it shared with any ministers?
Not that I am aware of.
Well, you were a deputy minister.
I was.
Yeah.
I was on leave in July 21 when it was sent to my office, and when I got back, I focused on Afghanistan. It was not put in front of me.
So who did it go to in your office?
No one. It was identified.
It went into a black hole.
Right.
Is that's your answer?
Thank you.
It was not briefed. I told you there was a flaw in the process. We've corrected
flaw.
that.
A big flaw.
So I'm just going to take a minute because I think this, we do pretty decent, and then there's like this giving the question and giving the answer. So I think we invited someone here today who comes with a really serious role, at least for me. So Ms. Thomas, your time and you being here means a lot to me, and I actually think to most members. And I would just say when we ask a question and then we say we're going to give you time to answer, then you give them time to answer. You don't provide them the answer. And for the best that I know, Mr. Cooper, you are not in the role that Ms. Thomas occupies. And she is here today to provide us the insights that we have asked for.
Sure, I respect Ms. Thomas, but she is in a very serious role, and what we're dealing with is a very serious matter, and I'm posing serious questions, and I think that's quite appropriate.
And I think you let her answer. You don't provide her answers for her. Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms. Thomas, for being here again today. We appreciate you participating in this important study, this ongoing study. So I have numerous lines of questioning, but maybe before I get into some of them, I want to clarify something. So what you've said to date is that there's a new directive from the Prime Minister that's leading to essentially more thorough briefs given to MPs when they or their families may be under threat. And that sounds like it's a new, there's a change in process there. And I'm just repeating back to you what you said, if I've got it correctly, that you're now briefing MPs on those threats, whether they're credible or not, whether the information has been verified or not, whether it's a complete picture or not, and whether it requires any action on their part or anybody else's part. Is that correct?
Thank you. Yes, that is the approach we're trying to take. It requires some trust because the investigations that are going on with regard to some of this intelligence mean that sources can be compromised. And so we are trusting that when the information is shared, it is not then made public by the Member of Parliament.
Right. So there's sort of a responsibility that goes along with sharing that level of information that and a level of trust that you're pointing to that's important. And I would agree with that, that with the disclosure of information comes responsibility. And I think it's a pretty important one when dealing with national security. So appreciate that. I also appreciate that members of Parliament, I know myself, if I were in Michael Chong's shoes, would appreciate that information. And I think you've acknowledged that. But one other flip side of this is if information and threats are not credible, do you worry that there's a risk that members of Parliament would then therefore feel threatened in a situation that has been uncorroborated? In the sense that, essentially you'd be letting them know about a threat that is not real, and that could psychologically and emotionally impact them and the way they do their work.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important point. I think the clarification would be about the word threat. That the foreign government is speaking about a particular member of Parliament doesn't mean that necessarily there is a threat against them. And I think that the criticality here is going to be how CSIS briefs the information. And I think that as we get into a process where we are more transparent, this will become less frightening and less worrisome. There will be some situations, as we have learned with Mr. Chong, for example, that it is more serious. But for the majority of parliamentarians, if there is a brief to them, I hope that through practice, through transparency, through this being a bit more routine, certainly not an everyday event, but a more routine kind of briefing, if we give them to an MP, we will be able to reduce the amount of anxiety that it causes.
Thank you. And we've heard from Mr. Johnston's report, and you've acknowledged fully that the coordination of information and communication is a challenge, and there are some shortcomings, and that you're already moving to address those and implementing new processes, which I appreciate. But I also appreciate, based on your other testimony, given the questions from Ms. Romanato, that there's vast amounts of intelligence, that there's numerous agencies involved, and that there's a funnel of information that's quite large. Not all of it is always shared with you. CSIS has a lot of it that they may sit on for a while. I'm wondering how you see your relationship, your office's relationship with the Prime Minister's office, and how information is ideally supposed to flow to the Prime Minister's office.
Very much for that question. I think it's an important element of this process. So the Prime Minister can receive intelligence through the reading package of the issues that he is tracking, and that would go to the Prime Minister's office, and it is shared with him. As Katie Telford said, intelligence is not held back from him. If there's something in particular that I feel he needs to see, that a fellow deputy minister or agency head feels he needs to see, or the clerk of the Privy Council determines that he should see, then we ensure it is put in front of him via his office.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau.
Is that the end of my time, Madam Chair?
It went quickly. Yes, it is, Mr. Turnbull.
It did. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Thomas.
Madame Gaudreau.
Ms. Gaudreau, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to go back to the culture of intelligence in Canada. And so I'm talking about within the Prime Minister's office. There are people outside the PMO who have that in-depth information and intelligence. Are they able to understand all the intelligence that comes in when it's time to triage it? I'd like to know what happens, because I have a feeling here there's this space in the middle, and that space actually was a gap, a serious gap. We need to change the course, and I'd like to know how you're going to do that. How are you going to close that gap?
Thank you. I think what's important to note is that the Prime Minister's office, senior members of the Prime Minister's office have daily reading packages on daily intelligence, similar to mine. Generally, geopolitics, where we have troops stationed, points of interest in terms of the Prime Minister's international work. Same as every G7 leader. In specific with FI and foreign interference, what has not happened and is now happening is that the unverified pieces of intelligence are now being shared with him in a way, or the unnamed sources or the unnamed individual, we're sharing that with him in a more regular manner. The Prime Minister's office, they get reading packages. They're put together by the client relations officers. It's the same process everybody follows. They also get weekly briefings by a group that works for me, the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat and PCO, and they will have a weekly brief either on sort of a range of issues, or they will ask for a curated package on a specific issue.
Il me reste quelques secondes. Pourquoi?
I have a few seconds left. Why wasn't it happening previously, systematically? That is to say, triaging that information. Why is it only happening now, truly happening? Why?
Again, I can't speculate on previous practice, and you will hear from my predecessors. In my opinion, that, and per the direction of the Prime Minister, he wants to be briefed, period, whether it is credible or not, and so he will be provided that information.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair. So I just want to go back to the discussion we had about the fact that you gave the example of being away on leave for a month and that there was information that was just, nobody was there to read it. So it was a bit of a black hole. So I'm just wondering if you could explain if that's been remedied, if there's a process in place to remedy it. But also, is that not an issue of security in itself? Like, was that not something that was sort of concerning when you came back after being gone for a period of time and you sort of, oh, there's this stuff. And I understand what you're saying. There's big things happening all over the world and you have to respond. And Afghanistan was hot, but you don't know what's hot in what's left that hasn't been read. So I'm just trying to understand, like, was that not something that was concerning about security? Again,
Rappel au
this idea
règlement,
of
Madame la
alerting.
Présidente. Je n'ai plus l'interprétation, je suis désolée.
Thank you. Is it working now? Can you hear what I'm saying now? It works again? I think that's fair, Mrs. Blaney, that from the top. Thank you.
Well, hopefully you got most of that question, but I know that my friend did not, so I will repeat. So I'm just trying to get clarification. What we heard from your testimony is that you were on leave for a month, and during that time there was information provided, and it sort of fell into a black hole. I acknowledge that when you returned, that there was important things happening in the world that, of course, brought your attention. But my concern is that when things are left behind, isn't that an issue of potentially national security? Because if nobody is reading, the group isn't reading so that you can draw attention to things, that's concerning to me. And I also want to know if that has been remedied or if you're in the process of remedying that, and how are you doing that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that's a really important question. So, number one, there should be, as I said previously, no single point of failure in terms of intelligence. That's why we are now bringing critical intelligence to deputy ministers to analyze and give advice on. That piece of intelligence in July 2021 named the only people who could read. So the Deputy Minister of Defence was the only person in Defence who could read it. That's different than must read. And so sometimes there are pieces of intelligence that the collector, CSIS or CSE generally, sometimes the RCMP, sometimes CFNCOM, say, no, you must read this, and then it's put in front of me. That particular piece of intelligence, as the Deputy Minister of Defence, was less pertinent to my job. So I was the only one in the department who could read it, but it wasn't necessary for me to function as the Deputy Minister of Defence and read it. So there is a difference there.
Okay, so then what I'm hearing you say to me is that things can get lost. That's what worries me, is again, I go back to that point, and again, we're talking about a point of privilege for a member of this place who did not know the circumstances in which he was living in, really. Like that's how I perceive it. And there are other names that are being added to this list. And so it wasn't impertinent for you. So I guess where is the stopgap to make sure that nothing falls through? Because again, what I'm hearing is that we have a black hole, and if nobody says we must read it, then the black hole will continue, and one day hopefully somebody will figure it out.
Well, thank you, but that's not exactly what I said. I said we have fixed this going forward, and that particular pieces of intelligence for that reference members of Parliament. That one in July did not mention MP Chong by name. But going forward, when there is a reference to a member of Parliament, it will be brought to the attention of the Deputy Minister community. It will be read by myself or whomever is acting for me, by other Deputy Ministers. It will be discussed, and a plan on what to do about it going forward will be made. And that will often include informing the MP about the situation, and it certainly includes informing ministers and the Prime Minister per their direction.
We will now go to Mr. Calkins, followed by Mr. Fergus. Mr. Calkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, thank you, Ms. Thomas, for being here today. I want to talk a little bit about Zhao Wei. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that Zhao Wei was the accredited diplomat at Beijing's Toronto consulate, and that was the diplomat involved in the foreign interference activities?
I can't give you a precise date. In the analysis and discussion of the information regarding Mr. Chong, it came to light that there was a particular individual, but I would have to go and look at my notes to give you an exact date.
Would you be able to provide that to the committee after you leave today?
I would be able to provide you the date where it was discussed by me. I can't tell you if it was discussed previously.
Thank you. We know that Zhao Wei was targeting a sitting member of Parliament and his family. He was spying on Chinese Canadians. The Globe and Mail reported on May 12, 2023, that CSIS was providing information to Global Affairs on Zhao Wei's activities as early as 2020. In the same report, Dan Stanton, the former manager in counterintelligence and CSIS, said that this information would have been shared with the Privy Council office. Why is it only when the Globe and Mail reported that Zhao Wei was targeting Michael Chong and his family did the government see fit to expel Zhao Wei?
I think that question is best directed to Global Affairs Canada.
It looks a lot to me like it's political damage control, and it's very hard for me to believe, Ms. Thomas, and maybe you can shed some light on this, that only one accredited diplomat from Beijing is currently acting in this way. Do we know of any other diplomats that are you aware, and can you tell this committee of any other diplomats that are behaving in this way?
I don't think I can speak about that in this open forum.
Illegal police stations. The government has made a claim as well. I mean, we've already heard Mr. Cooper talk about the fact that the Prime Minister made a claim that we knew a day later was actually not true. It seemed like he made a statement where he was fully aware that the information wasn't passed up, and then was trying to lead Canadians to believe that he actually didn't know. So he made a very specific statement about something, and then he said, as his defense a day later when it turned out to be false, that he didn't know. So we see the same pattern happening here with illegal police stations, where the government has said they have shut down. The Minister of Public Safety has appeared before this committee and actually said that police stations are shut down. We learned almost immediately after that statement is made that there are two Chinese or Beijing police stations still operating in Canada. So how many police stations, you're the National Security Advisor, how many of these police stations are still operating in Canada? Can you tell us? Because the government won't tell us.
There is continual investigations by the RCMP into the police stations. We are aware of 2 in Montreal, and work is being done to ensure that they cease to operate. Unfortunately, they're not police stations. They're often staffed, managed by Canadian citizens, and what we have to do is shut down their activities.
So if they're conducting United Front operations, whether they're using Canadian citizens or not in their employment, Are you saying that because of who they're using in their employment, they're not running a covert police station in Canada?
I'm saying that sometimes the individuals who are working in these are unwitting, or they're coerced, or they're forced, and so that the
Sometimes,
solution-
or is
this-
that what's actually,
this-
I don't mean to interrupt you, but is that what's actually happening, Ms. Thomas?
every situation is different. There is no one pattern. And so the tools used by the RCMP to shut down the police stations, reduce their impact, reduce their credibility, is different in every situation and every scenario. And so there would be value in our ability to arrest people for them, and those investigations are underway by the RCMP.
Early in your presentation, you made a statement about, and we can refer to the document the Public Safety Minister has made, where there's been a change in directive. The directive has been issued now that parliamentarians are to be made aware if there is any foreign influence intelligence that they should be advised of. But you didn't speak anything at all about political parties and the infiltration of political parties, and I don't see the directive from the government on that at all. So is there going to be, or is there a directive that I'm unaware of, where political parties will be informed of any infiltration into either their nomination process or their financing mechanisms?
In terms of their financing mechanisms, I think that belongs with Elections Canada as opposed to the National Security Advisor and the security
But
community.
Elections Canada
Sorry,
would
the
get that
time
intelligence
has.
from you.
I was
Would
just
they not,
letting
Ms.
her.
Thomas?
It has to be actionable so that something can be done. The nomination process is a distinct problem that has to be examined, and I think that we will have to have some significant conversations with the parties. What we have done as a first step is stood up the site process to analyze the by-elections, which is a new measure that we've put in place to keep by-elections safe.
Thank you. Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Thomas, for being present here today and for your service as the Intelligence and Security Advisor, as well as former Deputy Minister for National Defence. From your testimony today, and as well from previous testimony, we've heard that everyone would agree that when information is brought in and intelligence is brought in, it's partial. Sometimes it doesn't tell the whole story, and it can actually be wrong. And it's laden with caveats and cautions and the like. How does one paint a complete picture to assess the information that is coming in an admittedly a piecemeal fashion?
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a really important one. CSIS, as I said, and CSE, they have significant holdings, not all of which are released by a long shot to officials like myself. What they do is over time, using the techniques that they need to keep highly secure to protect both the methodology and sometimes individuals, to continue to collect. And often the action taken out of a single piece of intelligence is continue to collect. Within CSIS, they have a process where they do analyze what they're going to release and what they're going to continue to investigate and just hold. I think that it's fair to say they try to release things that are pertinent to the geopolitics of the period in time or relevant to other investigations and other concerns by government. But it is an art rather than a science.
So I'm a bit of a public policy nerd. Going forward now, you're going to be informing the minister responsible for public security and the prime minister if there's any intelligence which comes up that relates to a member of parliament or a senator, I would imagine. That information's sometimes, well, by its very nature, it's going to be partial, incomplete. When you come to me and you say, Greg, here's some information that we've collected, I'm going to have a lot of questions. Are you going to provide the same caveats that you would normally provide in terms of to the member of parliament to say, we've heard this, but we want you to understand this is based on one piece of information or perhaps two pieces of information which we can't confirm, which we can't assess, we don't have a complete portrait. Is that the kind of briefing that members of parliament will and senators will receive?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think that's a really critical element that needs to be discussed. By being more transparent, you can raise the level of anxiety, but I hope that we normalize the kinds of briefings that we have with members of parliament, whether they are caucus briefings, briefings to all parliamentarians, or just individual briefings on intelligence that has been gathered. We rely on parliamentarians to keep that information protected so that investigations can continue.
That's a big demand. As we've seen since these partial bits of information have made its way into the media, some people have taken that as gospel truth.
There is absolutely a risk to transparency. There is a greater risk to not talking about foreign interference.
Going in another angle on this, can you identify some of the systemic barriers that prevent a fluid exchange of intelligence between agencies and actors? And what checks and balances are going to be necessary going forward? And how can we better streamline the intelligence gathering and sharing going on a go-forward basis?
In terms of intelligence gathering, I think it's important that the agencies who collect speak to that rather than my observations on collection. The work that is done is difficult. It's highly technical. People put themselves at risk, and it's really important to the security of Canada that they be able to continue to do that job. In terms of the analysis and the advice that is given based on what's been collected so that Canada's national security is protected, that individuals are protected, that investigations can continue, I think that some of the processes that we've laid out will be useful and, in fact, help close some of the gaps we've seen. We're not going to rest on that, and I'm going to contract with some security experts to come in and look at our process and give us advice on how we can make it even better. And I'm certainly working with my colleagues in the Five Eyes to help us improve our process based on their experiences.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Thomas, we're entering into our second hour. Are you good to go? The rest of us are able to at least get up in between our rounds? You're okay? Perfect. If you need anything, we'll get it to you after the second hour, I guess now. We're going to enter back into a 6-minute round. I think that would be best so that people can maximize their time here. So we will start with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Sahota, et puis Madame Goudreau, et puis Madame Blaney. Mr. Cooper, 6 minutes through the chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and Ms. Thomas, through you, Madam Chair, and correct me if I have anything that I'm saying that is inaccurate, but as I understand it, going back to the July 20th, 2021 memo from CSIS that indicated that MPs were being targeted by a Beijing diplomat, one of those MPs being Michael Chong. It went to you as the Deputy Minister of National Defense at the time. It was a read only for you. In other words, no other official in your department was authorized to read that memo, but you were on vacation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And presumably you came back from vacation. And what happened to the memo?
It would have been destroyed through destruction processes. It wasn't lying around as a risk. If it had been relevant to the operating of the Department of National Defense or the information that we had to provide to the then Minister of National Defense, somebody else in the Department of Defense would have read it and actioned it.
Okay, so it was destroyed by the time you came back, and it went to the Prime Minister's then National Security and Intelligence Advisor. What happened to the memo when it reached his desk? Did it go into a black hole as well? You know?
As I have said to you, I'm not going to account for what happened with my predecessors. We know it was not presented to a National Security and Intelligence Advisor until mid-August for various reasons. And I don't just because of the reading packages that were being created.
And who would have been in that role?
At that time, it was David Morrison acting in the job.
So it didn't actually get to the PCO, you're saying, for almost a month.
No, it arrived in PCO in July.
It would have arrived in July, and then it went from who to who? I mean, I'm just trying to get an understanding of where these things go. I mean, this is a very significant memo. The information contained in it ultimately resulted in a diplomat being expelled from Canada. So where did it go?
It was in August, presented to the acting National Security and Intelligence Advisor.
In August, okay. You've reviewed the transmission records, is that right?
We've done some forensics on what occurred.
Would you undertake to provide the transmission records to this committee, or at least
We'll provide. I'm not sure I can call them transmission records.
Okay.
We'll provide what we have.
And what, as far as where the memo went?
Yes.
To who and when?
Yes.
On what days? Okay. Thank you for that. Now, do you have access to the top secret network email? Do you have your login credentials?
I have login credentials up to secret. Everything that is TS is presented to me.
Do you think that it is appropriate that the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, did not see an issues management note from CSIS sent in May of 2021 that indicated Michael Chong was a target of Beijing because he didn't have his login information? Do you think that's acceptable?
I don't think that is, in fact, what the reality is.
Then what is the reality?
Minister Blair would have been given a reading package. What happened in the Department of Public Safety at that time, I can't speak to. You'll have to speak to the officials who were there at the time. But Minister Blair doesn't walk around with a secret laptop logging into it. No minister does. We give them the information they need to read.
At the time of the July 2021 memo concerning Beijing targeting MPs, Mike MacDonald was the acting director. Is that correct?
Yes.
And last Thursday, a job opportunity was posted for Mike MacDonald's job within the office of NSA. Why did he depart your office?
Mike MacDonald is leaving for a different opportunity in the national security world, having done the job he is in, which is a 24/7 job for 3 years.
Okay. Do you agree that the failure to alert Michael Chong that he and his family were a target of the Beijing regime is a serious failure? Will you at least concede that point?
I acknowledge that Mr. Chong should have been told.
Who ultimately is responsible for this failure?
There is no one person. There is no single point of failure. I've said that already.
Do you accept that the Prime Minister is responsible for the machinery of government?
I do.
Do you accept that the Prime Minister has special responsibilities when it comes to national security?
I do.
Do you accept that the Prime Minister has special responsibilities for the government's relationship with Parliament?
Yes.
So you must acknowledge that this failure ultimately rests with the Prime Minister, if that is so. Isn't that right?
The Prime Minister cannot brief parliamentarians on things he's not been told.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We will now, Mrs. Sahota, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the witness, I wanted to ask about, I'm sure she's looked at the Independent Special Rapporteur's report. In his report, the Special Rapporteur noted that there has been too much posturing and ignoring facts in favor of slogans when it comes to foreign interference. As our most senior and nonpartisan public servant on national and security matters, do you believe that the polarization that we're seeing right now on this topic has made your work and the work of our security agencies more challenging or more difficult?
Thank you for that question. I'm not quite sure how I'd characterize it. I think the partisan nature of the discussion we're having clouds the ability to discuss foreign interference in a mature way as a G7 country should. And so I hope that the work of this committee will bring to light the seriousness of foreign interference and the work that needs to be done going forward to ensure that Canada is safe from foreign interference.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate your honesty. It's been questioned many times, what the proper forum for this is, and what we're seeing is whether it's at an independent investigation like the special rapporteur had, or anywhere for this matter, polarization has gotten so strong that it's been difficult to really find a venue where it doesn't exist right now. So it's been challenging even for us as members of Parliament, I think, to dig through this and get to a place, like you said, that where we can discuss this in a sophisticated manner. So Mr. Johnston, the Right Honourable David Johnston, also wrote that Canada requires a more sophisticated approach to our national security as well, and that we've just realized this through the current challenges that we're having. Would you agree with that? And what kind of changes do you think should be made, other than the ones that you have mentioned have been recently made in the weeks prior before coming here?
Thank you for that question. So I have outlined process changes that have been made to ensure that the material is put in front of the right decision makers so that decisions can be taken as to how to action intelligence. But I also think that it's time, and has been said by Minister Mendicino and others, that we have a foreign interference transparency regime. That we look at changes to the Security of Information Act, and that we look at CSIS changes. The CSIS Act came into being pre the internet age, the movement of information that we see now, the polarization that we see now, the rise of China that we see now. And so I also think it is time to look at how we modernize CSIS to be able to respond to the threats of today.
Do you have some ideas when it comes to how we could modernize, what particular changes should be made to the Act, since it's been so long?
Well, I think there's a few things in particular. Number one, I think with the foreign interference transparency regime, there needs to be criminal code changes that make not disclosing a criminal code offense. And other countries who have this same regime have taken that step, and it has given some meat and teeth to the regime itself. I think in terms of CSIS, there's a few things that need to be done. CSIS cannot disclose information that is protected to other levels of government and to opposition parties. And I think that was created in its day for a reason, but I don't think it meets the need any longer. And they need to be able to discuss classified information. I think that it would be very useful if that they had a method of disclosing that somewhere between their defensive briefs, which is the kind of brief average you hear from CSIS when they speak to parliamentarians about here is the threat, and they speak about it in very general terms, and then the threat reduction measures that are a very formal process because there is a specific threat against a specific individual, for example. There should be something in between there to allow them to have more general conversations with some protected classified material, not necessarily disclosing the totality of it, but allow them to have a conversation that is less general. One of the things we hear from members of Parliament when they have conversations with CSIS is, I don't really understand at this point if I'm a threat. That's not because CSIS doesn't want to share information. It means it's because they're limited in what they can share. And so that modernization of the CSIS Act would be extraordinarily useful.
Your answer is very informative. I appreciate that. And I think it's very useful to this committee to actually to take some action and to recommend some steps that the government can take. I won't remember whether you said that if there was a need to modernize NSIA as well, if you have any comments on that.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to analyze what should be done with this job. I think that in other countries, it is a job that has, I think, more authority, perhaps. PCO convenes I don't direct the security agencies, although we are giving more direction to them now in terms of the communication, flow, dissemination, management of material. Heard Mr. Wernick say it should be a 5-year job. I'm not sure anybody should do this job for 5 years. Again, because it's a 24/7 job. And you need to be a senior person in government to do it. That said, recommendations I'm sure would be appreciated.
Well, we thank you for your service, and we hope that you can stay well while doing it.
Thank you, Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Gaudreau. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yes, we truly hope that you will be here for as long as possible to put through these changes. Now, I'm just thinking, we've been looking at foreign interference since November in PROC, and I've sort of come to 3 conclusions because of the information that witnesses have shared with us. For example, thresholds, alert thresholds are much too high. Intelligence culture, as I referred to earlier, actually is inexistent. We don't really have one. And there's some chaos when it comes to analyzing intelligence, whether that be in departments or through mechanisms. Now, we want to shed light on this issue. We want to make sure that we legislate accordingly so that our democracy, our legitimate and dependable democracy, can be protected. Now, we're learning this morning that there's a new protocol, there will be new measures so that we don't have to relive what has happened in the past. But we're only learning this because we requested that the witness come here this morning. So I want now to talk about the culture of silence, because it's thanks to our media that are listening, and it's thanks to our media that we're able to inform people. We know that 2 people out of 3 in Canada who think that the Chinese government is trying to interfere with elections in Canada. So do you think it's normal that parliamentarians want to have an independent public inquiry in order to be able to allow you to be able to implement this process that you're talking about so that we can, in the end, reassure the public?
There's a lot of questions there, Madam Chair. So, first of all, are thresholds too high? Potentially. It is something that has to be examined. Again, CSIS is limited by their act. I know the director will have a view of this for you when he is here. The culture in the intelligence community is to protect information and to continue to collect more information. I think that changes to the CSIS Act, working with RCMP, perhaps, and I will add the ability to move intelligence from intelligence to evidence will aid in our ability to do something with this intelligence of consequence. I don't agree with chaos as a characterization. There are some extraordinarily good analytical minds working on intelligence analysis in CSIS, CSE, Privy Council Office, and other departments. What we do with that analysis is where we need to raise our level of sophistication and our level of clarity. I agree that we need to speak more about national security, and we have to do it in a manner that is transparent, that is clear, that is understandable in French and English and other languages, and we are not good at that. Because we are protecting information all the time. And that leads me to my concern about a public inquiry. There would be very little more than what I have said here today that I would be able to say in a public inquiry. The Security of Information Act protects it. Protecting the sources of the intelligence is critical. Protecting the techniques in terms of how we collect intelligence is critical. And so I think the hearings that Mr. Johnston has recommended and will be undertaking are really important, that they be as open and transparent as possible with stakeholders, with diaspora communities, with yourselves. about what the next steps are. I think that an inquiry could mean that we are examining this rather than moving forward with change. And I think we have an opportunity right now to make change in how we do things that would be very important to the national security discussion and the level of understanding and sophistication of Canadians about national security issues.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair, when I say chaos, I'm not necessarily talking about the skills or qualifications of people. What I'm saying is that there's a missing link. There's this vacuum, this gap. For example, when there's a person like the witness before us who has a right to a vacation, that means that information can get lost. And when we hear this, we think that change has to be made. Not only that, but the general public has to be informed and aware. And currently, even as a parliamentarian, I'm not aware of what's happening. And that's why this is a cry from the heart. That's why I'm saying it's normal that we get to the bottom of this, that we have an independent public inquiry so that we know what needs to be done. Because when I speak to the public, they say, well, nothing really is going to change. We know what happens. And I'm very troubled by that. There are elections ahead, not in 4 years. So I'm very troubled by this. And because I have a few seconds left, I'd like to ask you this. You are going to have a right to more vacation leave soon. What are you going to do to make sure that there is no gap this time?
Thank you. Again, if the intelligence that had been received when I was on vacation was pertinent to how we did our job in defense, it would have been actioned. So there is a difference between must read and may read. And that's really important to understand. And I am being transparent with you, and I say I was on that list in July 2021. I think it's important for Canadians to understand that the work done by our security agencies and senior public servants through the SITE committee and the panel of 5 to ensure elections are safe and sound is critical, and it also has concluded that there was no impact. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I will also say that cleared parliamentarians in NCCOP have access to this material, and NCCOP should be listened to and used to the benefit of all parliamentarians.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you, Chair. So you did mention earlier that Mr. Wernick did suggest that the government should legislate the position, and you said that you felt that 5 years might be a little too long, which is fine. But you also spoke about how other countries give this role a little bit more authority. And I think when Mr. Wernick was talking about this, he was talking about a higher level of accountability, especially in the giving and receiving of information, which seems to be a bit of a gap within the system. So I'm just wondering, when you look at what other countries are doing, and I expect that you're focusing on our Five Eyes partners, what kind of change in this role would you think would make sense for us moving forward?
Thank you. So I would like to first of all say that I am accountable, and I take my accountabilities very seriously. And if there is a failure...
Sorry, I want to interrupt you on that, and I apologize to the observers. So I'm not talking about your accountability. I think what Mr. Wernick was saying, that by legislating it, there would be a formal process of accountability that would track the exchange between information given and how it's received. And that one of the challenges that we are hearing very clearly from your testimony today and from other people's testimony is that sometimes things don't go where they're supposed to go, and that's causing this problem. You're also saying that you're working very diligently to fix that issue. So I just want to make it clear, I'm not calling you personally into question about accountability. That can be a conversation for another day. What I'm trying to get firmly is, what do we need to have within the role that you now fill so that we have some accountability that we can measure? Because right now it feels like we're trying to get to a moving target instead of having something very clear and precise so that accountability can be there. And so I hope that helps you.
It does, thank you. So deputy ministers have accountability as the accounting officers in the department, which is of course different in Privy Council office because the clerk is the senior public servant. In my role, I think that more ability to direct within the national security community would be useful. Legislating, the Privy Council operates under the Crown prerogative, and so there's a whole series of things that need to be examined, and the clerk has directed us to look at it. After hearing Mr. Wernick's comments, I have not yet given it perhaps the thought, as he just testified or said this 2 days ago. I haven't given it the thought yet that it needs, and I'd be happy to discuss it in the future with you once we've had a chance to look at what the range of options for structure of this job and what they should be. I will note that the Prime Minister announced yesterday a Deputy National Security and Intelligence Advisor so that we are able to both operate at the tactical level and the strategic level.
Well, thank you. So you did mention, and maybe I just want to clarify that during your initial testimony that there will be new staff coming in for intelligent review and to provide advice, which seems to be one of the gaps is that advice has not been necessarily provided. So I'm trying to understand better the structure. Is this your team, or is this expanding the people that work with you directly, or how does that relationship work? Because again, I'm coming back to that thought of how do we measure the accountability? Because what we're hearing, and it is unclear because of the way the information is being shared, where information is going, when it arrives, who sees it, why don't they see it? So I'm just wondering, is this going to work, and is it working as a team, and what role do you play within that team?
Yes, intelligence collection and dissemination and analysis in Canada and all of our Five Eyes allies is a team sport. Various agencies collect, analyze, and make determinations about that intelligence. In my team, what we have done is directed what information needs to come to deputy ministers for discussion and advice so that it is not, as I said, a single point of failure when something isn't briefed, and that it is not only one person's view of what we should do with that intelligence. We've also recently, today, given direction to agencies and collectors of intelligence how it will be disseminated and logged in terms of who's read it. And so there's an accountability framework that we're putting in place for the individuals who are named who should read a piece of intelligence to ensure that they have or have not, and that we have a weekly report that tells us who's reading, who isn't, and what has happened to that particular document. So it is a system that has operated for years, and we're bringing more structure to it.
Well, thank you for that. So I guess, one of the things that we're trying to figure out, so I understand now you're saying MPs will be briefed immediately. So I guess my question is around the threshold level. That we've heard that again and again, that sometimes the threshold level is just far too high and it doesn't really meet the needs that we have within our system. So I'm just wondering, with MPs now being briefed immediately, does that mean you're changing the threshold? Or is it just specifically for this? And how are you going to manage educating members of Parliament and other parliamentarians about how to receive this information in a way that is helpful to them?
Thank you for that question. If I said immediately, I apologize. They will be briefed, but there will be a period of analysis about what can be briefed and what should be said. The threshold can be too high, and that's a limitation within the CSIS Act. So as I said, there is work to be done on that front. The education element that you raise, I think, is the most critical in all of this. We do not brief members of Parliament frequently enough on national security issues, foreign interference, and their own threats. You saw yesterday that there was an article in the CBC about ministerial security and public official security. It's not just ministers by a long shot. Another thing that we don't talk about enough is the physical threats to members of Parliament. And so we are embarking upon a transparency regime to share more information and to talk about this differently in Canada.
We will now go to Monsieur Berthold, suivi par Madame.
Mr. Berthold, followed by Ms. Romanado. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Ms. Thomas. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, asked you recently who was ultimately responsible for the failure of the transmission of information to MP Chong.
For the failure. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
You said not one person responsible for the failure. Is that correct?
I said that there is no single point of failure.
Okay. J'ai vécu dans.
I'm a member from Mégantic-l'Érable, and I'm going to refer to the tragedy in Lac Mégantic, where many people lost their lives. There was an analysis, much was done. Safety Transport Agency established that there had been errors in the process. But no one ultimately took responsibility for the failure of all these systems. Now, here we are today, and no one has enough courage to take responsibility for their failures.
I will say that if a lack of information flow to the Prime Minister were to happen while I'm the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, it is my accountability. I will not speak to what happened in the past, but I can speak about what happens during my tenure working for the Clerk of the Privy Council and the Prime Minister.
Mais vous reconnaissez que.
But you acknowledge that ultimately there are individuals responsible for these failures. I mean, let's say something had happened, Ms. Thomas, to Mr. Chong or to his family during this delay where he hadn't been informed of the threat. How would we feel? We would all feel very guilty that this hadn't been avoided.
The intelligence collected had indicated that there was going to be imminent action. Mr. Chong would have been briefed under the CSIS Act, threat reduction measures. Should he have been briefed on the information that was available at the time? I think the conclusion now is yes. There was no physical threat to him, and I want to make that very clear, which doesn't mean that this is not serious.
Mais on ne peut pas.
However, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but one cannot presume that CSIS has access to all the discussions that are taking place on a foreign basis, for example.
Which is why the direction from Minister Mendicino is quite clear that MPs are to be briefed.
Est-ce qu'il devrait y avoir un procès?
Should there be an investigation process in order to determine who didn't do their work?
You will be hearing from my predecessors, and you need to ask them what their logic was in the moment and at the time that these reports came forward. I think it is critical before we leap to conclusions that there was negligence. You need to hear from them why they made the decisions they did in that moment.
J'ai entendu les mêmes choses.
I heard the same things during the Lac Mégantic tragedy. That's why I'm somewhat concerned, Ms. Thomas. Now, I want to go back to the police stations, Beijing's police stations. You said that there were 2 police stations that were operating in Montreal. It's very difficult for us to understand why on April 27th, the Minister of Public Safety stated that these stations had been closed, but they're still operating. And we tried to find out how many stations are operating or have been operating in the country. You said there are 2. However, we've only referred to Montreal. Are there others in the country? Because the Journal de Montréal had a very clear table, and they stated that in Vancouver and Toronto there were these types of police stations. So I'd like to know if those ones are still operating.
My understanding as of today is that the ones that had been operating in Toronto and Vancouver are no longer operating.
Est-ce que vous avez...
Do you have any information to the effect that other police stations are operating, or diplomats, for example, that have diplomatic protection are acting in a way to monitor the Chinese diaspora, are still doing that in this country under here?
I do not have any further information about police stations. New information could come to light as soon as I leave this room, but as of today, I do not know of any others. There are, yes, proxies of diplomats that are working contrary to the interests of the diaspora community. And that is a good, significant element.
Combien?
How many?
I could not give a number.
Because you couldn't, or because you don't know?
Do I know a precise number? No. Proxies work in a range of ways, so I can't give you a number.
Thank you. Mrs. Romanado?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you again to the witness. Focusing on the question of privilege, and I want to pick up a little bit on where my colleague MP Blaney was focused on in terms of educating members of Parliament. We heard testimony very clearly that the intelligence community doesn't understand the business of politics, and politicians don't understand the business of intelligence. And when Mr. Chong came to testify before our committee, he mentioned that he had had 4 briefings with CSIS. The first one initiated by CSIS June 24th, 2021, and 3 subsequent meetings that he initiated with CSIS. Now, having been a parliamentary secretary in the defense portfolio and having sat on the defense committee, I have had various intelligence briefings, so I understand what they are. Would you not agree that perhaps having all members of Parliament and senators and their staff be briefed on what to look for? What does foreign interference look like? You know, whether it be on the lookout for someone who is trying to be involved very much in your campaign, putting out information that's a little bit erroneous so that you will correct it, things like of that nature. Because as you understand, intelligence community are always looking at gathering intelligence. Well, there's a lot of information probably that members of Parliament have, but they're not aware that they have that information because they're not aware of what to look for. So once they have the understanding of what intelligence agents are doing, that they would be able to provide the appropriate intelligence agencies also feedback. And we heard from another witness that Canadians writ large may be privy to information that would also help the intelligence community. And this is sort of a whole of Canada approach. We have, a state actor who is trying to undermine our democratic institutions, and I think all Canadians would agree that we need to work together to counter that, deter and counter, and those missing pieces of the puzzle altogether might be able to make sure that in 2 years' time, when there's another election, we're not in the same situation that we are here today. So could you elaborate, in your opinion, do you think providing members of Parliament, senators, their staff, with at least a better understanding of what foreign intelligence looks like, but also Canadians writ large, and then what would be the channel for them to feed information so that they can help be part of the solution?
Thank you. I think you make a very important point, or series of points. The director of CSIS has been before this committee and other committees, and certainly in the public, talking about the need to talk about foreign interference and the national security of Canada. And it's not a conversation we generally have. We talk about a lot of other things in Canada. And so raising the level of understanding of what national security threats are, who is interested in Canada, who could possibly be working at cross purposes to Canadian interests, I think is a really critical conversation. I think that it is absolutely a criticism of the national security community that the conversations we have with parliamentarians are potentially anodyne, not specific enough, not descriptive enough in terms of the things to watch for, and that is something we are working to change. And I think that some of the things that we have done regarding elections that continue to evolve are really important for Canadians to understand. So the Panel of Five and the Site Task Force are normally connected to a caretaker convention when there is a general election. Well, we've got stood up the site panel to analyze what's going on in 5 by-elections right now. The Panel of Five, it was recommended by Mr. Rosenberg that the panel actually meet between elections. So the Panel of Five will begin to meet this summer to ensure that there is continuity of the period before a general election, so that the panel members understand when they see a piece of intelligence during that election period, they understand what's come before it and they see the totality of the picture. that kind of action, I think, which we could certainly report back to parliamentarians, is critical to be transparent, to raise the level of awareness, to know what to be on the out for, to know what techniques are being used by adversaries, so that in the election, not only can we watch for them, we can prepare all of you.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Godot. Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, how is it that we're learning so many things this morning? We're talking about transparency, providing information to reassure the public. And here in PROC, there are people watching us, and I can only say thank you to the media. I'm not at all reassured by what I'm hearing. So with the time that I have left, I'd like to know, because I'm giving you a cry from the heart, I'd like to hear you say, I'd like to hear you tell us what you're going to tell us, what you're going to do in the future. I don't want to know what's happening right now. I want to know what's going to happen in 3 months, 6 months. How is it going to unfold in the future?
Thank you for that question. I don't have a crystal ball. I would hope that members of Parliament and Canadians.
Je n'ai pas la traduction, rappel au règlement.
Point of order, I'm not getting the interpretation.
Just pausing the time. Ms. Thomas, did you get the question? Did you hear the question? Is it working for you now? Okay.
Thank you. So I don't have a crystal ball. I would hope that I can reassure you that over the next months, you will see more communication from the national security community. You'll see more dialogue with Canadians, with diaspora communities, that we will talk about foreign interference in a more open and transparent manner, and it can be done without revealing national security classified information, that the briefings that we give to members of Parliament will be more specific, plainer language, and give you examples of what to look for and what the concerns are. I hope that members of Parliament will be briefed more frequently if they are a target, and the direction from Minister Mendicino is very clear about that. I think I would hope that in terms of internal process and dynamic, that we will have a steady flow of information and advice, and the advice part, as I say, is critical to government about what to do about particular scenarios, situations, and that we will start to address and change the tools that are needed by the national security agencies in order to be able to do their jobs.
Then I'd like to also say that with your influence and your qualifications, that you'll also be doing something to reassure the public so that there is true transparency, because at this point in time, there is very high concern. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just a brief comment before I ask a question. I heard what you said earlier about a public inquiry, and I agree that this discussion has become far too partisan, which is part of the reason the NDP feel it's important to have a person leading this process that is selected by all parties, because we need to move out of this rhetoric and really deal with the issue. But we also are at a place where Canadians' sense of trust in our systems have been profoundly impacted. And that, I think, can only be solved by a public inquiry. So I appreciate you sharing your opinion, and I just took my opportunity to share mine. So my question to you is Mr. Chong, when he spoke, he talked about the fact that he was briefed generally quite a while back about what foreign interference looks like. He said he heard that about 40 MPs received that briefing to just alert him, not to specifics around his own reality, but just in the broad strokes of what does it look like when that could be happening to you. So I'm just wondering, it makes sense to me that all parliamentarians should be briefed on what that looks like, so that there's a better understanding. Again, part of what I'm hearing in a lot of the testimony is that we need to raise the literacy of parliamentarians and Canadians on how to address foreign interference and how to start to see it. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on if that's a good thing to move forward. And we also heard testimony that more parliamentarians should actually be going through the similar process as they do in NSICOP, go through that, have clearance, and then have more access to information, just so that we can, again, remove the partisan reality and have more parliamentarians not understanding necessarily top secret issues, but having a better understanding of what's going on, taking that promise and oath to not share that information. So I'm just wondering, when you look at this, do you not feel concerned that maybe parliamentarians themselves are not being given the right tools to address this issue and to better understanding it when they are briefed?
Thank you. So it's a complex set of questions you've asked. I think that NCCOP could be used more effectively with their cleared members to understand the intelligence being collected and how it's being actioned within the national security community. And I think that it's a very critical committee. Clearing more parliamentarians is complex, and intelligence is, of course, based on the need to know. And so I'm not sure clearing more parliamentarians is the answer. Talking about the threats in a unclassified but very clear, very precise manner, I think is part of the solution. I don't think one-on-one briefs with parliamentarians are necessarily needed or possible, but when we speak to parliamentarians as a group, I do think that we have to change the way that we do it.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper and then Mr. Turnbull, and we'll have Ms. Thomas on her way. Mr. Cooper.
Ms. Thomas, through you, Madam Chair, I want to pick up from my last round on a few points. When I raised the fact that Minister Blair did not have his login to access the issues management note provided by CSIS that indicated that Michael Chong was being targeted by Beijing, you said something along the lines that my question wasn't grounded in reality, or that that was not reality. Well, at page 27 of Mr. Johnson's report, it states, quote, neither the minister nor his chief of staff received the IMU. Both indicated, and we have confirmed with the public service, that they do not have access to the top secret network email on which it was sent, end of quote. So what part of what I had asked you is not grounded in reality?
Well, the way I heard your characterization was that they simply didn't have a login and therefore did not access the system. They don't have access to the top secret network. The material is printed and provided to them as is appropriate.
And Mr. Johnson goes on to further indicate that, quote, it is certainly the most prominent but not the only example of poor information flow and processing between agencies, the public service, and ministers, end of quote. Would you dispute that?
That's why we're changing process.
Yeah. Quite late in the game. Now, further to following up on my last round, when I asked you about the July 2021 memo that indicated that MPs were being targeted by Beijing, including Michael Chong, you indicated that that memo had been presented to David Morrison, who was the then National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. You then said the Prime Minister was not briefed about it, had no idea about it. I would remind you that that memo from July of 2021 was a month before the federal election campaign, involving allegations of interference, targeting democratically elected members of Parliament. If that doesn't get to the Prime Minister, then what does?
Madam Chair, I've said I'm not going to speculate, and you have the opportunity to ask the incumbent of the job that question when they are here. I ensure, as the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, that he receives the information he requires, particularly on foreign interference, but also on a range of other subjects.
You said when you last appeared before this committee that the Prime Minister is briefed frequently on matters of foreign interference. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, has said that the Prime Minister reads everything and that nothing is held back. And here we are 1 month before an election in which MPs are being targeted by Beijing, and suddenly the Prime Minister hasn't been briefed. Suddenly the Prime Minister that reads everything hasn't read this memo. How is that believable? And what does it say about this Prime Minister and how seriously he takes Beijing's threats to our democracy and interfering with the ability of members of parliament to do their jobs, because they were being targeted because they were doing their jobs and speaking on behalf of their constituents and speaking on behalf of Canadians. And the Prime Minister suddenly, conveniently, is in the dark. What does it say about him?
That is you're drawing fallacious conclusions. The Prime Minister cannot make determinations about information he was not given, and he was not given the information. Period.
The Prime Minister, who is responsible for the machinery of government, who establishes information flows to his office, the Prime Minister who is so concerned about national security, but suddenly he knows nothing. How convenient. I think that Canadians can very easily draw the conclusion that this is a Prime Minister who doesn't take Beijing's interference seriously, and that this is a Prime Minister who very conveniently acts as though he didn't know. I think he did know. I think most Canadians believe he did know. And if he didn't know, it's just as big of an indictment on his total lack of leadership. And moving on, are you involved in political discussions with the Prime Minister, the PMO, the Cabinet, or Liberal MPs?
So I have a couple of things I'd like to say. The Prime Minister was not provided that information. This isn't question period. So that conclusion that you drew is political. Oh. It's not based in fact. The Prime Minister wasn't provided the information.
It's based in fact that he supposedly didn't know, and he should have known, and that's an indictment on his lack of leadership.
Sorry, I'm going to just pause. There's nothing to pause. So, Ms. Thomas, please keep your train of thought. Mr. Cooper, the buzzer has gone off. I did provide you your 12 seconds back earlier that you had given to me. With that, Ms. Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
When political conversations are occurring, I'm not generally in the room.
That's all. Thank you. Mr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think what we just witnessed was both fallacious arguments and salacious conclusions drawn from those deeply flawed arguments that Mr. Cooper has been pounding the desk and making in this committee over and over again. And it's shameful, if you ask me. I would like to get down to the facts. Ms. Thomas, in Mr. Johnston's report, he says very clearly there is no intelligence indicating that the PRC took steps to threaten his family, referring to Michael Chong. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So there was no actual threat or action undertaken to realize that threat?
That is correct. There's no doubt that the information that was provided to Mr. Chong is disturbing, but there was no action taken.
And we can all agree that it's disturbing to think of any elected official or their family even being considered in terms of threatening activity or intimidation. And I agree completely with you on that. In terms of this top secret network email, which seems to be the source of a little bit of confusion, you've said clearly that very consistently with Mr. Johnston's report, that ministerial direction in place at the time means that CSIS should have briefed the minister at the time. Would you not agree with that?
CSIS should have briefed, yes, probably. And there is a role for the deputy minister in there.
Okay. And you're saying that you don't have access to that top secret network either. I think you said you have access, but it's a lower level of access. Is that correct?
So I can log into the secret network, but I don't log into the top secret network. Top secret materials provided to me by what we call a CRO, a client relations officer from CSE.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And you've said that the minister should have had whatever intelligence was related to this printed out, and that he would have viewed it in a secure location. Is that correct? Not through the top secret email.
That's correct.
Thank you. And from your testimony today, I've sort of become interested in statements about credibility ratings on intelligence. So is credibility rating always included in intelligence documents?
Yes, when we receive raw intelligence from any of the agencies, they normally tell us a range of things about the credibility or the soundness of the report.
And how important is the credibility rating?
Well, it allows you to draw conclusions about whether something is actionable, whether we need to wait for more information, how we should assess what we are reading. And so it's if it's a single source, it's not a credible source, there's no further intelligence about a particular element or allegation or action that could be taken, we gauge ourselves accordingly. And so no one piece of intelligence, as we've said, is generally a smoking gun, for lack of a better term. It is a totality.
Yes, you've said
as a member said, it's a puzzle piece.
Thank you for that. And how useful then is intelligence that doesn't come with a credibility rating?
It could be, at the end of the day, enormously important and significant in a total picture. In and of itself, it gives you an indication of something that might happen, or maybe is happening, or maybe is not. It's as I said, an art, not a science.
Could be as irrelevant as it is important. So it's a bit of a coin toss in terms of how relevant it will end up being, given the fact that it doesn't have a credibility rating. Is that right?
Right, and that you have to see the totality of anything that came before it and what continues to be collected. And it's that credibility is part of how the agencies make the determination with limited resources if they're going to continue down this particular thread of investigation and collection.
Got it. And so I think it's notable that the leaks in the media haven't included a credibility rating, as far as I know. I think Mr. Johnson has said something about that there were drafts made. And so I wanted to ask you, does that point to where the information that were the source of the various leaks that have come through the media, how credible that information is and where it may be originated from within the security and intelligence environment?
So, Mr. Turnbull, and I would usually give the floor back to Ms. Thomas, but our time has come to an end. So, Ms. Thomas, if there is anything else you'd like to share with committee members, please just send it to the clerk, and we'll
Chair, could I have a quick answer to that last question? It's a pretty important one.
Really quick?
I'm not sure I actually understood the question. I apologize.
And I can't have you repeat the question just because we just don't have the time. I apologize, Mr. Turnbull. I apologize, Ms. Thomas, but we do have Minister Blair joining us for the next hour, and our resources are very limited, and I know members will then, I'll get to deal with it, and I don't want to. So with that, on behalf of PROC committee members, we thank you for your time and attention. Again, if there is something else you'd like to share, please just send it to the clerk, and we'll have it put out in both official languages. And please, we're suspending real quick. We'll be back at noon. Thank you and have a good day. In our next panel, we have the Honorable Bill Blair, Minister of Emergency Preparedness, and from the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Tricia Geddes, Associate Deputy Minister. Minister, you'll have up to 5 minutes for your opening comments, and the floor is yours. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, colleagues, for the kind invitation to appear before you today. I will try to be brief in my opening remarks to give us all sorts of opportunity to ask lots of questions and have a conversation. There is a single core issue at the heart of this study. Let us be clear, no parliamentarian or their families should ever be threatened for advocating their beliefs, for representing their constituents, or for acting on behalf of their constituents. Colleagues, Canadians elect us to speak on their behalf. about the future of this country. We can and do disagree often, but it is utterly unacceptable that any member of Parliament be made the target of possible violence, and I want to assure you all that I stand behind anyone who is the victim of such malicious behavior. I first learned about the possible threats against the member for Wellington Halton Hills when they were published in the Globe and Mail last month on May 1st. They were serious claims and particularly disturbing as they named both the member and his family. While security considerations restrict what information that I am able to share, I can tell you that at no point was I ever briefed on a threat of violence by a foreign actor against any parliamentarian. And I want to assure you all in this committee that if I ever had received such intelligence, I would have asked that it be swiftly referred to law enforcement and action be taken to protect that member and his family. If there is ever evidence of a threat of violence against a Canadian, it is critical that the matter be referred to the police immediately for further and appropriate action. Foreign interference has been a significant threat to Canadian interests since before this government was elected, and it has become even more serious in recent years. In our very first mandate, we took our first steps towards addressing this problem, including investing in cybersecurity capacities and passing legislation to strengthen the security of our elections. Shortly after I became the Minister of Public Safety, COVID-19 drastically changed all of our lives. The national security landscape evolved rapidly, and new threats emerged at a near unprecedented rate. There was an observable increase in activity from hostile foreign actors attempting to interfere with Canada's national interests. And in response, in 2020, I sent a letter to each member of Parliament to advise them on the severity of this threat and to explain our government's efforts to combat it. And as I wrote at the time, this government values above all the well-being and safety of Canadians. Whenever malign foreign states seek to harm our communities, undermine our values, or jeopardize the very institutions on which this country is built, we will take action. And this remains true today. We were and still are seeing interest from malicious foreign actors to attempt to intervene in Canadian politics, behavior that went well beyond normal diplomatic activity. And that's why I explicitly instructed CSIS to provide awareness briefings to those who they believed could be a target so that they understood those risks and knew how to defend themselves against these attempts. But let me be clear again. I was never informed of any attempt by a foreign actor to harm a parliamentarian or their loved ones. And while CSIS made the determination of who should be briefed, I understood that several MPs received one in advance of the 2021 election. Our government's work on this issue is far from done. We have continued to make important progress since the last election. Budget 2023 included $13.5 million to establish a national counter-foreign interference office at Public Safety Canada. The RCMP has also received $48.9 million to strengthen its capacity to protect Canadians from hostile foreign actors. And my colleague, Minister Mendicino, has been holding consultations on a foreign interference transparency registry, and I'm pleased to report that these consultations have been wrapped up earlier this month. We've received positive support to proceed. Colleagues, as the Right Honourable David Johnston has said in his report last week, there are questions that are too important for partisanship, and in his words, what hangs in the balance for all of us is confidence and trust in our democratic institutions, the very confidence and trust that foreign interference seeks to undermine. We must continue to review these matters in a way that respects all of our national security obligations, including those that put their lives including for those who put their lives at risk, collecting intelligence in the field. And while I will caution that I am limited by what I can speak to in a public setting, I very much appreciate and respect this committee's work to raise awareness of this serious threat to all Canadians and to Canadian institutions. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll happily respond to any questions our colleagues may have.
Thank you, Minister Blair, for keeping your comments so concise. We're now entering 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull, puis Madame Goudreau, et puis Madame Blaney. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. Through you, Madam Chair, to the Minister, you very specifically stated that you had not been briefed about any MPs who were the subject of threats of violence. However, were you briefed about intimidation or interference concerning MPs? Violence is a very specific word.
Yes, indeed. And thank you very much for the question. I appreciate the opportunity to provide clarification. I had a number of discussions with the director of CSIS with respect to the issue of foreign interference and particularly the activities of the Chinese government. but I did not receive any specific information about interference targeting any individual MP. I was aware that there was concern within CSIS that interference could be directed towards unnamed MPs, and that's why I asked CSIS to conduct awareness briefings for those individuals.
Minister, now you indicated moments ago that you first learned that Member of Parliament Michael Chong had been targeted by Beijing through the Globe and Mail. But we know that CSIS had attempted to inform you that MPs were being targeted, including specifically MP Michael Chong, in an issues management note that had been sent to you and to your chief of staff via a top secret email, and that you didn't see that note because you didn't have the login in information, and neither did your chief of staff. How is that possible?
First of all, what you have just described is not correct. You've got your facts wrong. But I'm pleased to have the opportunity to explain how that actually works, if you'd like me to.
Please explain.
Yes, of course. First of all, there is no email account in which top secret information is shared with ministers. There is a secure terminal that is located in certain offices, but not in any political office, and certainly not in the minister's office. I had no access to a terminal in which this information was shared. And the way in which information was brought to the attention of the minister was that it was determined by the director of CSIS what intelligence information the minister needed to know. They would then print out a copy of that and have me attend at a secure location, and the director of CSIS would brief me.
Minister, with the greatest respect, Mr. Johnson, in his report, stated that CSIS had sent this to you and your chief of staff, presumably because they wanted you and your chief of staff to see it, and you didn't see it because you didn't have access to it. That's what Mr. Johnson said. Is he wrong?
Well, allow me to clarify that information was not shared to me. It was authorized by CSIS to be shown to me, but they determined, and I would leave that to the question perhaps you might want to put to the director, but the director determined this was not information that the minister needed to know, and so I was never notified of the existence of that intelligence, nor was it ever shared with me.
Well, Mr. Johnson said you didn't have access. You didn't have access. Those were Mr. Johnson's words.
And in fact, that is factually correct, that the terminal was, there's no terminal, such terminal where such information would ever be made available in a political office, certainly not in the minister's office. It was in a secure location. I did not have access to that terminal, and the only way in which information that was provided, the intelligence, the top secret intelligence that was provided on that terminal would ever be brought to my attention was if a positive decision was made by CSIS to bring it to the attention, and then I would attend either a SCIF, a secure location, or to their offices where that information would be briefed to me.
Well, Mr. Johnson characterized this as the most prominent example in terms of a breakdown in information flow. And you were the Minister of Public Safety. It was under your purview. It was under your watch as minister. So what does ministerial responsibility mean to you?
My responsibility is to deal with information that our national security intelligence agencies bring to my attention. In this case, the National Security Intelligence Agency made a determination that this was not information that needed to be shared with the minister, and they did not share it with me. And so it is a concern, and I think that concern has been well addressed by a recent ministerial directive issued by my successor in that role, Mr. Mendocino, in which he has directed a ministerial directive.
Through you, with great respect, Minister, I take it from your answer that ministerial responsibility means to you that you just don't take responsibility.
Well, and I would submit that that's completely incorrect. I take a great deal of responsibility for every matter under my mandate and my responsibilities. But this is a situation where it's an operational decision of CSIS as to what information needs to be passed along to government. And in this case, they made an operational decision that was not required. And subsequently, 2 years later, when it was leaked to the press, then that information has subsequently been shared with me. But at the time, I had no knowledge that it existed. I had no knowledge that it was not being shared with me because I wasn't aware that that information was available. And CSIS, quite appropriately, made a determination that they didn't believe it was necessary to pass that information along.
Well, Minister, I would submit to you that the buck stops with you as Minister of Public Safety, and it is quite an indictment on this government that you as Minister of Public Safety, the Prime Minister, and the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, the current one, found out about this in the Globe and Mail. Quite an indictment.
That wasn't in the form of a question, Madam Chair. Did you want me to respond?
The way committee works is that I do try to provide some opportunity for people who we have invited to provide some responses, because sometimes what happens is that we are individuals in political fields and it's tough. And I need the information that you are providing.
Then if I may respond?
Quickly.
I disagree, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Blair, through the chair to you, I think what we've just heard is another fallacious argument that is coming from the Conservative benches, which we hear quite regularly. It's unfortunate, and I want to go through a few of those. But before I do, maybe I'll just ask you a very quick question. Can you act on what you don't know about?
Well, I think rather obviously, Mr. Turnbull, I cannot. However, I think the collection of intelligence is important, but it's all, the RCMP, for example, who also reports to me then as the Minister of Public Safety, don't brief on operational investigations. They come with the results of that, and very similarly with the National Security Intelligence Agencies, they make a determination based on their own assessment of the intelligence. And intelligence can take many forms, it can have many sources, and the CSIS has a responsibility to determine its validity, its credibility, and whether it in fact it is necessary for action from the government in response to the intelligence they've gathered. They make that determination, and quite clearly, if they determine that information is not required to be shared with us, and I have no knowledge of that, I would not have the opportunity to act on it if it's not being shared.
And that's very clear. I guess, what is implied there is that they did not think that information needed to reach you. For what reason would you be able to cite that were the case?
Again, I'm a little bit reluctant to speculate and I think that's a question more appropriately put to the Director of CSIS with respect to the decision he made not to share that with government, with the minister responsible or with anyone else. I think that's, I would not want to speculate as to how they came to that determination, but I'm aware, having worked, frankly, in the intelligence field for a number of years myself, that there are various assessments made about the validity of intelligence and its importance and the urgency of taking other actions with respect to that. One can only conclude that by the decision not to share this information that CSIS did not believe that was in fact necessary, but I think that's a question better put to the director.
Fair. That's very fair. I think there's been another allegation in relation to surveillance of an elected official, namely Michael Chan. And the allegation is that, that it took too long to sign off on that surveillance. And I just wondered if you could speak to, there's been allegations on this that is circulated in the media. Basically, the implication that Conservative Party has made is that you dragged your heels on this and that you should have signed off sooner. I believe that there's a whole process of due diligence that you've spoken to, and that this would be a very, very serious matter that you wouldn't take lightly as a decision when making, i.e. choosing to surveil an elected official at the provincial level. Could you speak to the process without getting into specifics? I know you couldn't speak about that, but the due diligence that would be necessary.
Thank you for acknowledging, Mr. Turnbull. I've in fact taken an oath not to discuss the particulars of any particular investigation or warrant that may or may not have been issued, and I'm not going to break that oath. There's a good reason why those matters are kept confidential. However, I can state categorically that the information that was reported, first of all, in the Globe and Mail was false. It contained, factually incorrect information. And I can also advise you that quite appropriately, in all warrant applications, not any one in particular or specifically, but in all warrant applications, there is an appropriate process of due diligence. But there's also always an acknowledgement that this work must take place expeditiously, and I would like to assure Canadians that there was never a circumstance, notwithstanding the false suggestion that was put in the newspapers, there was never any unnecessary delay, and in no case was the timelines that were described in the paper even close to what actually may or may not have transpired in this case that I've taken an oath not to discuss in its particulars.
Thank you. And I know that something else that we've heard quite regularly coming from the opposition party is to claim the false claim that our government has done nothing when it comes to combating foreign election interference. I note that you spoke about this briefly in your opening remarks about the response to the December 18th, 2020 motion on foreign interference that you gave. I've read that and it's quite detailed. I wondered if you could, in way of dispelling this, again, this myth that the opposition parties seem to be trying to perpetuate out there in the public, that our government has done nothing. If you could speak to some of the particulars of the very real things and steps that we've taken to demonstrate the seriousness which we take this matter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. And I would like to assure this committee, but also my colleagues in Parliament and all Canadians, that we took this issue very, very seriously. And right from the outset of us forming government in 2015, some very positive steps were taken with the establishment of the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, additional authorities for NSIRA as well, and some very positive steps we've taken in order to deal with this. There has been a number of legislative remedies brought forward that I think also strengthens Canada's resiliency. But in response to the motion that was passed in Parliament, I thought it was very important to very fulsomely respond and to name specifically the issue of foreign interference and some of the countries, particularly China, that were involved in that. I had a number of discussions with the director of CSIS on how to appropriately respond. I also thought it was so important not just simply to table a report, but I mailed a copy to every parliamentarian because I thought that information was critically important to them in doing their job. I wanted to make sure that they were all well informed.
Thank you.
And subsequently...
So, yeah, thank you.
And we're done.
Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Gaudreau, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Minister, for coming. Madam Chair, would it be possible to ask the Minister to just speak a little more slowly for the purpose of the interpreters who've been working for almost 2.5 hours? And I congratulate them as well on their work, but I want to make sure that I'm hearing everything you're saying. I want to come back to something because perhaps I didn't fully understand. And it has to do with the time it took to authorize that 4 months. When we listened to Richard Fadden, he said, and he was the former advisor and director. So we heard him say that it was a very long time, or we felt that it was a very long time. So what we want to know is when there has to be rapid action. What would you say to Mr. Fadden when he says it takes a long time to act?
Thank you very much for the question. I will try to speak slower, and I apologize to the translators. I think it's a very important point. Thank you for the reminder. First of all, I don't disagree with Mr. Fadden that the timeline as described in the Globe and Mail was a very long time. And I want to assure you, it's not true. It just didn't happen. Like, that timeline is absurd. There is, however, important work of due diligence undertaken by CSIS, the Department of Justice, Public Safety Canada, and even officials in my office to ensure that the signing of any Section 12 warrant is a very significant intelligence effort, but it's also a significant intrusion upon people's privacy, and therefore it requires due diligence. There were also issues that the federal court had raised with respect to the duty of candor, for example, that CSIS had a responsibility for. And so there is always an appropriate level of scrutiny and diligence that must be applied. But when these matters were brought, and I can't speak specifically of a case, and you'll forgive me, but when these matters were actually brought before me for my approval, it was always done in a secure location, and frankly, it took hours, not days or weeks or months. And to form that approval, I recognize the importance of being diligent and the importance of acting expeditiously. And I want to assure you that that took place in every case.
Thank you. So, with all your experience, Minister, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the opinions of experts who came before this committee and said that there was an overclassification of documents, of intelligence documents. And we heard Ms. Thomas say earlier, sometimes there are 3,000, 4,000 pieces of information per month. So I want to know if the intelligence culture within PCO is deficient in some way.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as deficient, but let me make some acknowledgments, if I may. I think we should always, I think transparency is very important. The Canadians want to see and see the evidence of the actions that their government takes. And so I think we should always attempt to be as open and transparent as possible. Having said that, I also know, having worked in that area for a number of years prior to becoming a politician, about the importance of maintaining secrecy around the collection of information, the people that might be involved in that collection, investigative techniques, and how that information is collected. And some of that information is of a very sensitive nature that could impact the reputations of our government or our country or private Canadian citizens. And so there are some things, quite frankly, that must be kept secret and should always be kept secret. But I think we should also reflect on, like, things that can, we don't, in my opinion, have a good system of declassifying secret material, and not everything is as sensitive as some things are. And I want to acknowledge that I think that's work that we need to reflect upon and work that we need to do, because as this committee has heard from many witnesses, transparency and trust are at the heart of everything we do. And I think it's important upon us to explain to Canadians why some things must be kept secret and why other things, should be more publicly available.
Well, I'd like to use the little time that's left to talk about this. Let's talk about transparency and trust. Numbers talk. 2 out of 3 Canadians think that the Chinese government is attempting to interfere in our elections process here. And approximately half, and I'm really concerned about this, Minister, approximately half feel that the next elections will not be free elections. So we've learned many things over the past while that I wasn't aware of and that the general public isn't aware of. So what do you intend on doing? And do you intend on being humble enough to be able to say, we are going to correct our course now so that people will be reassured? Because right now you're losing that trust. What would you say to those people through your actions?
It's a very important question. I think the public trust, that is the currency of the work that we all do as politicians and we do here in Parliament. And without the trust of the public, we don't have, without the trust and consent of the public, we don't have the ability to do our job. A couple of points I would clarify. You said the Chinese are intent on doing this. It's the People's Republic of China. It's the government of a foreign nation, a hostile nation, that is actually targeting, and they are targeting to interfere not only in our democratic institutions and our elections, but in many other aspects of our society as well. And so we have an absolute responsibility to protect those Canadian institutions and to protect Canadians. I think to earn that trust.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney.
Well, thank you so much to the chair. And as always, everything that I say goes through the chair. And thank you so much, Minister, for being here with us today. I think public trust is the very essence of what we're discussing, which is why the NDP put forward a motion that actually said every party has to agree on the person who's leading this process, that we would like to be a public inquiry, because I think it's become fraught with political rhetoric. And the key issue for me is I want to have Canadians trust their institutions, because if they don't trust their institutions, that becomes a very scary place to be. And so we're here today specifically to talk about the question of privilege, but to try to unpack what happened and where the gaps are. So, my first question to you is really around how you received information from CSIS in that role. What is the process, and is there a problem with this process that needs to be addressed? We've heard testimony that has shared from experts that have said, intelligence is going, but there's not necessarily appropriate advice. When intelligence is going over to someone, there doesn't seem to be a very good process of making sure that that intelligence was consumed and how it was consumed and what came out of that. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about the process part from the history that you've lived through and where we might want to see that improved, and if you felt at any time that this was a concern for you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Blaney, for the question. I think the issue of how, let me explain perhaps how intelligence was shared with me while I was the Minister of Public Safety. I would receive information usually from the Director of CSIS, or one of his staff that they had information that they needed to share with me. I would then be asked either to attend that there is a secure room for those types of briefing here in Ottawa. Actually, there's a couple of them, and there's one in Toronto. And so I would very frequently, depending on where I was at the time, go to that secure location. At that location, I would be I would be brought into a room, and in hard copy, never by email, but in hard copy, that information would be shared with me, and I would have the opportunity to read it, but also to ask questions about it. And the question you raise, I think, is the most important one. Just consuming intelligence and information, and this is what people think is happening or might have happened, or someone suggested this is happening to them, it really raises questions about, and then what? What next? What do we do about this? And for example, should there, Mr. Johnson asked me, if I had become aware of any threat to any parliamentarian or their family, what would be the response? And I said, call the police. Like, how could you not? Like, our first responsibility is to protect people, and we cannot leave people in jeopardy. But that is a question that rises with every intelligence briefing. I think there are ways to improve how that information is shared with various people in government, particularly the Minister of Public Safety and others.
Well, this leads me to a second question. In the role that you had, of course, I heard what you said about wanting to call the police and hoping that would be addressed. And the concern, of course, is that we now know that MPs were being targeted and they didn't know for an extensive amount of time. And it's hard to respond in any way if you don't know that you're being targeted. The other issue that has come up that Ms. Kwan and Mr. Chong have both brought up, which is that there's ethnic communities that are being targeted, and people have come forward to the RCMP, to the police, as you noted. And when they go and come forward with this information, what they're finding is that actually there isn't a lot of awareness of how to respond to that. So people get a file number and then they never hear back. And so they feel under threat. They may have more experiences, but they stop going to get help because that help doesn't seem to be there. So I'm wondering, in the role you previously had, was there any discussion about what we need to do in terms of building our infrastructure within Canada, so that when we do call the police or the RCMP, when things like this are happening, that there's actually the capacity and the understanding of foreign interference in a meaningful way to respond to it. And so that's where I'm concerned, because it seems like, I appreciate what you're saying, but it seems to me that what we're hearing is that the police and the RCMP actually don't have the skills necessary to respond to that. Or why would we be hearing from so many communities saying we've gone for it, I have a file number, nobody ever called me back?
Yes, ma'am. A couple of things. When CSIS advised me that there were activities of the hostile state, China in particular, the People's Republic of China, directed towards Canadians, and it could include parliamentarians, although they didn't name any individual or any specific interference on any individual in most of those cases. I asked that in fairness to those parliamentarians and in fairness to those Canadians, that we had to conduct awareness briefings. You had to tell people that this is what interference looks like. Here's how to recognize it. Here's action you can take to protect yourself from it. Like you can't just leave people vulnerable to such attacks because they can be quite insidious and quite serious. And so I asked that intelligence briefings take place. I think that was important. Secondly, I think you've identified a significant challenge, and it's this issue of intelligence to evidence. And it's where the National Security Intelligence Agencies collect intelligence, and the ability to then take that intelligence and use it for criminal investigation or prosecution can be quite challenging, and it's work that's ongoing. I think there is some legislative and judicial responses and considerations that we need to concern ourselves with. But let me also acknowledge that I also work very closely with that diaspora right across the country. And there have been situations where they have been intimidated or threatened, and those are very serious matters. We have a responsibility to protect all Canadians, and our national institutions like the RCMP and CSIS have a responsibility there. We have to make sure they're adequately resourced, and as you said, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we are putting significant additional resources into the RCMP, for example, to enable them to do those investigations and to protect those Canadians. But I would also acknowledge to you that there's work to do. There's more work to do.
For that. Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Fergus. Mr. Cooper, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, Minister, through you to Chair, to the Minister, through you, Madam Chair. Always through the Chair. Are you familiar with the 1988 Supreme Court Van Wienen decision? Otherwise indexed as the Queen and Chesson?
No, I'm not.
Okay. The Van Wienen decision stipulates that CSIS must identify the individuals they believe will be intercepted talking in the surveillance process while applying for the warrant. Does that ring a bell?
I know what you're talking about now.
Thank you. Are you aware that CSIS has to provide a list of third parties who may be intercepted talking to a target of surveillance during the application process for a warrant?
Yes.
In the warrant application for Mr. Chan that you approved, did CSIS identify any individuals that may be intercepted in the course of surveillance who are members of Cabinet, any sitting members of Parliament, or senior officials in government?
Mr. Cooper, I took an oath not to discuss or disclose any information relating to any of those matters, and I intend to uphold my oath.
I'm going to put this to you in general terms.
About your question, Mr. Cooper, and I'm not going to answer it.
I will ask
All right,
you
so
a
I'm just going to
question.
pause the clock real quick. And I feel like sometimes that alone helps. As we know, one person speaks at a time. Minister Blair, I know you don't frequent this committee, but we do appreciate you taking the time to come, and you responded really quickly, and that's something I said to Ms. Thomas as well. Because of a little bit of the culture of this place, members who sit on the committee do tend to, I guess, have the time. Wherever I see that you're not getting time, I will make sure some is provided to you to answer. But sometimes, just with the importance of this topic, we know where it's headed. So I'm just going to let us get through this together, okay? All of us. Great. Mr. Cooper, the floor is back yours.
I will pose the question more generally. In any warrant application that you approved, CSIS warrant application, did CSIS identify any individuals that may be intercepted in the course of surveillance who are members of Cabinet, any sitting members of Parliament, or senior officials in government?
I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper. That information is something that I am not prepared to discuss in a non-secure setting, simply because I've taken an oath not to. And I intend to uphold that oath.
Are you aware of Mr. Chan in any way communicating with members of Cabinet, any sitting members of Parliament, senior officials in government?
Is there any context to your question? Saying that Mr. Chan's been around a long time.
Yeah.
I will tell you that when I was the police chief, I encountered Mr. Chan on a number of occasions. Is that the nature of your question?
Okay, well, how long have you known Mr. Chan? Has he been involved in any of your political campaigns?
I don't believe so directly, but I'm aware of the man. Like I said, I've known him since I was a police chief in Toronto.
Do you consider him to be a friend?
No, sir.
How long has your chief of staff known Mr. Chan and worked with him?
I haven't any idea, sir.
You have no idea?
No.
Okay. Minister, through you, Madam Chair, did you receive the PCO Daily Foreign Intelligence Brief dated February 21st, 2020, that stated that there was an active foreign interference network by Beijing in the 2019 election?
Actually, I'll have to check. I don't recall that particular
Well, maybe
date.
to help refresh your memory, on December 21st, 2022, you were quoted in a global news article acknowledging that you had received certain information from that memo. So I presume you have seen that memo.
Well, again, it's a classified document, and I
well-
can't discuss classified documents in this setting.
You may not. I certainly appreciate you're not able to talk about classified documents, but what has been produced to this committee in that memo, so it's not classified, spoke of an active foreign interference network by Beijing in the 2019 election. That isn't classified. Did you see that?
I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper. I've seen quite a number of documents. I can tell you during that period of time, we were taking action to respond to foreign interference by the People's Republic of China against our government. So, but I can't speak to this particular document.
Madam Chair, through you, this is not intended to be a prop. Just to try to refresh the minister's memory, this is a document, a memo, that has been one of the very few documents that has been produced to this committee, so it has been asked multiple times. I'm surprised you're unfamiliar with it, given that fact, given that you're appearing here on foreign interference, given that you were the Minister of Public Safety, and given that you stated on December 21st that you had you acknowledged having received certain information. So I'll put it to you again. Did you receive that memo? Were you aware of that interference network by Beijing? And what did you do with that information?
Yeah, I would like an opportunity to confirm. I want to give a forthright answer to this committee. If in fact that particular memo was shared with me, I can't see what you've held up from this distance, and it appears to be heavily redacted in any event. But I'll certainly determine whether or not that briefing in fact took place, when it took place, and I'll happily report back to this committee.
No, there's no really quickly, because the members who sit here, you guys know the beep goes off, and then you know how I am. And then if I don't run a tight ship, then you guys complain to me that you didn't run a tight ship and we didn't get all our rounds in. So, I wouldn't sit on the fence for too long, because after a while it does start to hurt. Monsieur Fergus.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank the Minister and his ADM for being here today to answer our questions on this important issue. Minister Blair, can you go into more detail about what steps the government is taking to combat foreign interference?
Thank you very much, Mr. Fergus. There's been a number of, I think, very significant efforts on how we've been dealing with foreign interference and election interference in particular in this country, and it began as early as 2015. There has been, for example, the establishment of the NSI-COP committee in order to provide parliamentarians with insight into all of the intelligence that we were receiving and the actions that we were taking. I've actually got quite a list here that I'll be more than happy to share with you. But there has been a number of fairly significant investments made as well into how we respond to this, and in particular, for example, the RCMP, as I've mentioned, recently received $48 million to strengthen its capacity to protect Canadians from hostile actors. There's been a significant investment of $13.5 million in the National Counter Foreign Intelligence Office at Public Safety Canada. We have also made a very strong attempt to improve our intelligence collection and our intelligence sharing. to the extent possible. And I would simply point out during my tenure, Mr. Fergus, when I was public safety minister, CSIS continued to advise of a growing threat of interference from a number of hostile state actors, including the People's Republic of China in particular. And we made a very conscious decision to be very forthright and public about that threat, to tell people about it. That's one of the reasons that I tabled a report before Parliament in December of 2020 to make sure that people had an awareness. I worked very closely with the director of CSIS, who made a number of very significant public pronouncements. And in July of 2021, there was also reports that were published that particularized the nature of this threat. And so while the government was making significant investments and taking significant steps to protect our elections, and as well, as you're well aware, I should have mentioned that there was also a group of officials that was stood up in order to monitor the impact of political interference on our elections. They did important work on our behalf in order to determine, and as well, Elections Canada was notified of information that could be also relevant to their important work of maintaining the integrity of our elections, and where foreign money, for example, might be contributed. There are a number of significant steps that have been taken. And clearly, I think what has clearly been identified, and which we fully acknowledge, is there's more to do. And that's why I respectfully would suggest the important work of Mr. Johnson going forward in examining the issues and bringing expertise and information forward will enable us to identify additional steps that we can take as a nation in order to protect these important institutions.
So this is really important in terms of the go-forward aspect of things. But there has to be also some accounting for the past. And you had mentioned in your testimony, in response to questions from some of my colleagues across the way, that you weren't provided this information beforehand. How can you act on information you don't have?
Well, very obviously, Mr. Fergus, you can't. And if I want to be very, very careful, though. I'm not suggesting that CSIS purposely withheld information from me. They make a determination on the credibility and the seriousness of the intelligence that they've gathered, and they make a determination on what needs therefore to be shared with a minister or with the Prime Minister or even publicly. And so in this case, they did not come to that conclusion.
And this is going to be a really tough question to answer in a quick period of time. But why is it that within this system there is a reluctance to share national security allegations that are unproven, uncorroborated with government?
Well, I think there's two very, very valid considerations in that question. The first one is that information is sensitive in its nature, and it can have significant impact on reputation, on our international relations, and on the interest of Canadians. And so I think there should always be a thoughtful consideration on how intelligence would be used or shared. There's also the issue of not wanting to compromise investigative technique, those who risk their lives in collecting this information or providing that, being the source and providing that information to our government. And there's also, there's a process in intelligence gathering. Intelligence is not in and of itself facts and evidence.
Thank you.
It's information which is assessed and determined by our officials who make their best estimate of what this means.
Thank you.
The fear of getting rebuked. Thank you very much for letting me have
Madame
that extra time.
Goudreau?
Ms. Gaudreau. Thank you, Chair. Minister, Michael Wernick on Tuesday came a second time before this committee. And, you know, he was the former clerk of the Privy Council, and he said in response to the last question that the Prime Minister should stand up in the House and announce strong legislative steps that will be taken. So that was 48 hours ago. And even yesterday, it was said that there is urgency to show how important transparency is and accountability. Well, what happened? We don't know what was said in caucus, but is something going to be put forward?
Yes, ma'am. It's an important question. And I think Parliament does have a very significant role to play here and a responsibility. We've already identified, and there have been consultations on the establishment of a foreign agent registry, which I think is going to be very important and will provide us with very important tools. I think there's also a reflection on the application of the CSIS Act. You know, it was written in 1984. The world has changed quite significantly, and we believe that there are some legislative remedies that would be appropriate and need to be brought forward. But I also think it's really important that information, because there are significant impacts and implications for Canadians, for our privacy rights, for our Charter of Rights and Freedoms with respect to this type of legislation. And that's why it's so important that we bring forward legislation, but that it be subject to vigorous debate in Parliament and the work of our committees. And because I think we all need to make sure that legislative response to these circumstances is robust and effective, but it also has to be done thoughtfully and carefully. And I think, you know, we all understand. I also hope that Mr. Johnson's review is going to provide us with insight and advice from a wide variety of Canadians and perspectives that will inform the important work of how should we respond to these issues. It's not just an operational issue. There is a legislative response that I think we need to very carefully consider.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to say that if an individual, or let's say a judge or a commissioner, had been chosen by parliamentarians, even someone from out of the country, if someone else could have been chosen to ensure neutrality and impartiality, because it would have been better, because my constituents are saying, look, what happened? This person was appointed by the Prime Minister. So I think the Prime Minister knows what to do, but doesn't necessarily want to do it.
Madame Blaney?
Well, thank you, Chair. So, Minister, when you were in the role of Minister of Public Safety, I know that the government launched the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission. And, of course, the mandate was to find out what happened on those 2 days. And I'm just curious about the process in terms of, for this commission, did they have to deal with any secure documents, information that couldn't be made public? And if so, what sort of protections were in place so that the commission could deal with that and see those sensitive documents that couldn't be made public?
Thank you for the question. The public inquiry headed up by Justice MacDonald for the Mass Casualty Commission, there were a number of RCMP, primarily investigative documents that were relevant, that were made available to the Commission, some in a redacted form. But the circumstances of that particular tragic event and the information and evidence that was brought before the Commission did not sort of cross as significantly into the realm of that which would be considered highly sensitive, top secret information. Some of it was of a secret nature, which is a different level of classification, and we were able to work very carefully through the Department of Justice with the Mass Casualty Commission to make as much information available to that commission as possible.
So thank you for that. My next question, and probably my last with the limited amount of time that I have, is you spoke earlier when we were having that discussion back and forth about the intelligence and how it moves into evidence. And I think this is something that is very interesting, because it is the part that really allows action to happen. So I'm just wondering, when we look at things such as foreign interference in our systems, in our elections, where are the gaps in that, and what do we need to look at more broadly? And have any of our Five Eyes partners, for example, done any of that work that we could look at? And is it a legislative remedy, or is it something else?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a question perhaps better directed towards our justice officials, because there are fairly significant legal impediments to because the way in which intelligence is gathered and some of the legal authorities used for the gathering of intelligence actually preclude that intelligence information from being used as evidence in a court of law on a criminal charge. And so there are some legislative remedies, but I don't consider myself an expert in how to navigate through those things, and it's a question better put to justice.
Thank you. Mr. Berthold.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Minister Blair, through you, Chair, I'd just like to sum up a little what has been said. You're not denying that the warrant that you received regarding Michael Chen included references to other MPs or ministers. Did I fully understand what you said earlier?
Suspect not, sir. I was neither confirming nor denying it. It's information that, quite frankly, I have no intention of discussing. I've taken an oath not to.
OK, but vous n'y êtes pas.
But you're not denying that.
I'm neither confirming nor denying. I'm simply not speaking to it.
Vous avez dit tout à
Earlier, you stated that the Globe and Mail article on this 4-month timeline that you took to approve the warrant, you said about this article that it was incorrect. Am I right?
That's correct. It's correct that it was incorrect.
So, c'est particulièrement pratique.
Well, it's quite straightforward to be able to say that an article is false or incorrect and then invoke confidentiality to not necessarily correct the record. And in SNC-Lavalin, the government also spoke about the article that was written, and we all know what happened with that. Now, on another topic or matter, you said that you were informed that the Beijing regime had interfered through unnamed MPs. When were you informed of this?
I don't believe that I actually said that.
Yeah.
I said that they were undertaking it. They were conducting an effort to interfere. I was concerned that there would possibly be some members of Parliament who might be interfered with and without any knowledge. And I wanted to make sure that they were given sufficient information and awareness of that interference, how to recognize it, and how to take steps to protect themselves. And so I had asked CSIS to conduct awareness briefings, but they did not tell me who or the nature of any interference they might be experiencing.
But when did CSIS tell you about these unnamed MPs, these unnamed MPs, as you said yourself, might or could be the subject of interference on the part of Beijing?
Okay, to be very clear, CSIS did not advise me of any individual MP or any even number of MPs. My concern was that for all of us, for all of you and us, that if you could be subject, that we should provide you with awareness to protect yourself.
Mais vous avez pas.
But you didn't get up one morning and say to yourself, I should talk to all MPs about this. You received some kind of report that was sufficiently concerning that MPs should be made further aware of this issue. So when were you informed that these kinds of operations could be happening?
You may recall, because I sent you a letter and every other member of Parliament in December of 2020, in which I outlined political interference by the People's Republic of China as a 12-page letter. I posted it, I tabled it in Parliament.
I know.
I posted it on the website, and I sent you a copy.
I know. When CSIS informed you that it will need you to inform the MP that this is happening?
CSIS did not tell me that they needed me to inform the MP. We discussed...
No, when were you informed that you should and that something has to be done? So just someone has to told you that. Quelqu'un a dû vous informer.
Someone must have informed you, the Minister of Public Safety, that you needed to do something. You didn't just wake up one morning and decide that you were going to send a letter to all the MPs to tell them to be careful. What exactly happened? How did you reach that decision? Who advised you to send that kind of letter?
Minister of Public Safety, I received information with respect to the activities of hostile state actors, including the People's Republic of China. No one told me to act, to warn you. It was a decision that I made. It was my job to protect you and to protect all Canadians and institutions. And so I believe the best way to do that was to provide you with information so that you could have an awareness of the threat. And then I also suggested to CSIS that if there were individuals that they believed would be particularly vulnerable to the threats of interference, that they should conduct awareness briefings with those individuals. They did not tell me who or why, but I have learned subsequently that they in fact did a number of those briefings.
Why didn't you ask? Because it was a threat to our democracy. It was a threat to members of parliament. Why didn't you ask if there were some MPs that were specifically targeted? That was your responsibility as minister. Why didn't you?
Well, these are operational matters of intelligence and a responsibility for CSIS. They were collecting intelligence and they were taking the steps and working with other national security intelligence agencies in order to protect the members. I did not have any information that any individual MP was targeted or in any way threatened with interference. However,
okay, I'm going to end that.
Okay.
So I think sometimes it's just nice to get a fulsome answer without me speaking in between. Members know when the beep goes off that they don't get to comment again, but it's just a matter of giving somebody who we say we want important information for the information, well, the opportunity to give us the information. Minister Blair, I'm sure you're noticing that 1 o'clock is approaching. Are you able to provide me some leniency? Please.
Yes, ma'am, of course. I do have some responsibilities in about 15, 20 minutes' time.
Okay.
But I'll be happy to give you what I'm able.
Our interpreters have been going for almost 3 hours, so we don't want to be here too long. But just quickly, 5 minutes to Mrs. Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the Minister for being here. And I just want to touch base on, just following up on the previous round of questions. Minister Blair, I know that the communication that you sent out to members of Parliament was actually your initiative in response to a December 18, 2020 motion on foreign interference in the House. And I want to thank you for taking that initiative at the time to bring awareness to the issue, both by tabling a report in the House and to directly writing to members of Parliament. And I believe, if I remember correctly, we even received it snail mail, an actual printed copy, to make sure we received it, given the amount of emails that we do receive. So I do want to thank you for bringing it to the attention of members of Parliament. We heard a little bit earlier, and I was speaking with the National Security and Intelligence Advisor about the importance of making sure members of Parliament, senators and their staff understand what is foreign interference, what it looks like, what kind of tactics are used by hostile state actors in terms of trying to get information from members of Parliament. Can you elaborate a little bit on what your thoughts are on it being a reciprocal responsibility? For instance, intelligence agencies really don't understand politics, and politicians sometimes don't understand intelligence agencies, and that members of Parliament may be privy to information that would be useful to intelligence agencies, but we're not aware of the fact that intelligence might be helpful. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of, again, increasing awareness amongst parliamentarians about it, and what we can do to help each other make sure that we are working together to combat and deter any foreign interference?
Thanks very much for that. It's a very important question. You know, as politicians, you know, we work in very diverse communities. And with the diasporas that have come from all over the world to make Canada their home, they also have representation from various governments and government officials from their home country. And it is one of our responsibilities as politicians to work with that diaspora, but also with some of those other government agencies or actors. Every government, I think, attempts to influence and in some way, in a positive way, to gain some influence with the government of Canada. And so it's something that we're all aware of and subject to. But it's very important that politicians be aware that sometimes that attempted influence can exceed that limit and actually take the form of interference. And that sometimes it's important for people to understand a nefarious intent, and who is in fact a hostile state actor. And it's not just normally trying to have good relations or serve their communities, but they may have other intent. And so in educating and informing parliamentarians so that they recognize when that influence attempt that we all experience every day can actually translate into acts of interference. We need to be aware of that, and we need to make sure that we protect the integrity of what we do, the integrity of our institutions, and of course the integrity of our elections. And so keeping people aware of that I think is our first line of defense. There are other things that we can and we do in order to protect our Canadian institutions, but our best line of defense is informing, first of all, those who are actually working in the communities, and as well sharing information with Canadians so that they know how to protect themselves, they know how to be more resilient in the face of some of the interference attempts or even like some of the things that we know have taken place in our country. I think shining a light on that, informing people on that is very important. I think it's an important question. It's what I was trying to do when I issued that, and I tabled it in public. It was on our website. I wanted to make sure Canadians could see it. But I also knew that by sending it out to all parliamentarians, that was the best way to extend that information out into every part of Canada, in every community, through our colleagues in Parliament.
Thank you very much. And another point, I know we talked about a little earlier, this reference to a secret email that you didn't access. You made it very clear that that is not in fact how it works. That information that needs to get to you doesn't go into some email like your Gmail account that you only have the password to. That this is actually a physical a terminal that is not located in your office, that it is located in a secure location, and that to be able to access that information, someone with top secret clearance would actually get the information, print it, make sure you're briefed on it in a secure location. Is that correct?
That is correct. There was no top secret secure terminal located in the minister's office. Neither should there be. And that information is highly classified, sensitive, and needs to be handled with great care. CSIS would, in fact, identify that which needed to be, this concept of need to know, the determination of the National Security Intelligence Agencies would make an assessment that this is information the minister needs to know, and they would bring it to me. And if they didn't make that determination, I would not get the opportunity to see it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time and attention today. Ms. Geddes, you didn't get any questions or comments, and the minister didn't need you to provide any insight, so he's well aware of his file. Did you want to add anything today?
No, ma'am. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I mean, I would underline that it is the department's, the agency's responsibility to be able to access those networks, to be able to provide the information. In fact, as a deputy minister, I don't have access to those terminals either. We do rely on our staff to be able to ensure that we're provided with the intelligence in a timely fashion.
Excellent. With that, if there is anything that comes to mind, whether it be later or whenever, please just send it to the clerk, and the clerk will have it translated in both official languages and shared with members. With that, we thank you on behalf of PROC committee members for your time and attention today. We wish you the best of everything. For PROC committee members, Tuesday, June 6th, we will have the Right Honourable David Johnston appearing. We have been successful in our deviation requests, so it will be a 3-hour meeting that morning, okay? We will see you soon. Keep well and safe. See you next Tuesday.